Number 1. Andrea Yates, the mother who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub while their father was at work. Andrea Yates was born Andrea Kennedy on July 2, 1964, in Hallsville, Texas, the youngest of 5 children raised in a close-knit Catholic household where academic achievement and personal discipline were deeply valued. From an early age, Andrea demonstrated exceptional intelligence and a quiet, determined work ethic that earned her the position of captain of her high school swim team and an honor roll student who graduated near the top of her class. She went on to study nursing at the University of Houston, completing her degree and beginning a career that seemed to reflect everything her upbringing had instilled in her: compassion, patience, dedication, and a desire to care for others. By all outward appearances, Andrea Kennedy was the kind of young woman who had mapped out a stable and promising future, and when she met Russell Rusty Yates in 1989 through a chance encounter at an apartment complex where both resided, those around her believed she had found the final piece of that future. Rusty was an engineer with NASA, a deeply religious man who held firm convictions about family, faith, and the roles of husbands and wives within a Christian household. The two married on April 17, 1993, in a ceremony that marked the beginning of what many believed would be a traditional, faith-centered life together. What followed over the next several years was a life shaped significantly by Rusty's religious philosophy and his influence over Andrea's sense of purpose and identity. Rusty had been deeply influenced by itinerant evangelical preacher Michael Warnicki, a controversial figure whose teachings emphasized extreme interpretations of biblical scripture, the sinful nature of inadequate motherhood, and the idea that bad mothers raised children who would be condemned to hell. Warnicki's theology was harsh, uncompromising, and in many ways psychologically crushing for a woman already prone to anxiety and perfectionism, and Andrea absorbed those teachings with an intensity that would later be recognized by mental health professionals as deeply damaging to her already fragile psychological state. The couple's first child, Noah, was born in 1994, and Andrea transitioned out of her nursing career to become a full-time homemaker and mother, a role that Rusty strongly preferred and actively encouraged. John followed in 1995, Paul in 1997, and Luke in 1999. The family lived for a time in a converted bus, a lifestyle choice driven by Rusty's desire to simplify their lives in accordance with his religious beliefs. And during those years, the signs that Andrea was struggling were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She had always been quiet and inward, but those who knew her began to notice a withdrawal that went beyond introversion, a blankness behind her eyes that suggested something was eroding beneath the surface of her composed exterior. The first major psychiatric crisis came in 1999, shortly after the birth of Luke, when Andrea was discovered by Rusty holding a knife to her own neck. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with severe postpartum depression, a condition that her psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, treated with antidepressants and antipsychotic medication, and for a period Andrea seemed to stabilize enough to return home. Dr. Starbranch later testified that she had explicitly warned both Andrea and Rusty that having more children would be medically dangerous, that each pregnancy carried a significant risk of triggering a more severe psychiatric episode, and that the fragile balance Andrea had achieved was not a foundation on which to build further. Despite this warning, Rusty and Andrea conceived again, and their 5th child, Mary, was born in November 2000. The pregnancy and birth did precisely what the doctors had warned it might do. Andrea's mental state deteriorated rapidly and catastrophically in the months following Mary's birth. She stopped eating, stopped speaking at times, scratched patches of hair from her own scalp, and sat staring at the wall for hours without moving. She was hospitalized twice in the spring of 2001, once in March and once in May. And during those hospitalizations, she received treatment from Dr. Muhammad Said, who made the decision to discontinue one of her antipsychotic medications, Haldol, despite the fact that Andrea had responded positively to it during her previous hospitalization. Dr. Said later testified that he believed Andrea was improving and that the medication change was clinically appropriate, a decision that would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire case. Andrea was discharged from her second hospitalization on May 14, 2001, just 4 weeks before the morning that would forever define her name in the history of American criminal justice. On the morning of June 20, 2001, Rusty Yates left for work at approximately 9 o'clock, as he did every weekday morning, leaving Andrea alone with their 5 children: Noah, who was 7 years old, John, who was 5, Paul, who was 3, Luke, who was 2, and infant Mary, who was just 6 months old. Rusty's mother was scheduled to arrive at the house at 10 o'clock to help with the children, as she did regularly, giving Andrea a brief window of solitary time each morning. It was during that window, in the hour between Rusty's departure and his mother's arrival, that Andrea Yates carried out the act that would stun the nation and ignite a decades-long debate about mental illness, motherhood, and the limits of criminal culpability. She began by filling the bathtub with water. She then took each of her children, one by one, and drowned them. The exact sequence has been established through evidence and Andrea's own statements to investigators. She began with the younger children, drowning Paul, Luke, and infant Mary in succession, laying their bodies on her bed after each drowning. John was next, and John fought her, which the medical examiner's findings confirmed through evidence of a struggle. Noah, the eldest, was last, and by the time Andrea came for him, Noah had seen enough of what was happening to understand, at least partially, that something was terribly wrong. He ran, and Andrea caught him. After Noah died in the bathtub, Andrea left his body in the water, carried the bodies of the other 4 children into the bedroom, laid them beside one another on the bed, and covered them. She then called 911. The call was brief and eerily calm. She told the dispatcher that she needed a police officer to come to her home. When the dispatcher asked why, she said simply that she needed one to come. She then called Rusty at work and told him he needed to come home. When the first responding officer arrived, Andrea met him at the door and told him what she had done. She led him to the bedroom where 4 of her children lay covered on the bed, and she told him that the 5th, Noah, was still in the bathroom. The officer's account of what he encountered in that house was among the most harrowing testimonies presented during the subsequent legal proceedings. Andrea was taken into custody immediately and transported to Houston Police Department, where she was interviewed by detectives. She was cooperative, lucid in her recollection of the sequence of events, and explicit about what she had done. She told investigators that she had been a bad mother, that her children were not developing correctly, and that Satan had been inside her. She said she had known for a long time that she was ruining her children, and that she had killed them to save them from going to hell, that by dying before they were old enough to fully sin, they would be guaranteed a place in heaven. She said she knew what she had done was wrong under the law. The statements Andrea made to investigators that morning would become central to the legal battle that followed, with the prosecution arguing that her acknowledgement of legal wrongness demonstrated sufficient awareness to support a finding of criminal responsibility, and the defense arguing that her delusional belief system had so thoroughly distorted her perception of reality that she genuinely believed she was acting in her children's best interests. The case went to trial in February 2002 before Judge Belinda Hill in Harris County, Texas. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Chuck Rosenthal, and the defense was led by attorneys George Parnham and Wendell Odom, who mounted an insanity defense grounded in extensive psychiatric testimony about the depth and severity of Andrea's mental illness. The trial was one of the most watched and debated legal proceedings in the United States in the early 2000s, drawing commentary from mental health advocates, legal scholars, religious communities, feminist organizations, and the general public in equal measure. The psychiatric testimony presented during the trial painted a portrait of a woman who had been in the grip of severe and progressively worsening psychotic disorder for years, one that had been inadequately treated, exacerbated by repeated pregnancies against medical advice, and shaped by a religious environment that fed her delusions rather than countering them. Dr. Philip Resnick, a forensic psychiatrist and one of the nation's leading experts on filicide, the killing of one's own children, testified to the defense that Andrea suffered from severe postpartum psychosis with schizophrenic features, and that at the time of the killing she was operating under a delusional belief system so complete and so disconnected from reality that she genuinely believed she was saving her children rather than harming them. Dr. Resnick explained that Andrea's delusion was not simply that she was a bad mother in the conventional sense, but rather a fixed, unshakable psychotic conviction that Satan had taken control of her body, that her badness as a mother was corrupting her children's souls at a fundamental level, and that the only way to rescue them from eternal damnation was to send them to God before they could be fully corrupted. This was not, the defense argued, a woman who killed her children out of rage, jealousy, selfishness, or any of the motivations typically associated with criminal violence. This was a woman who, in the throes of a devastating psychotic break, believed with absolute certainty that she was performing an act of profound maternal love. The prosecution countered with their own psychiatric expert, Dr. Park Dietz, who testified that Andrea had been aware that her actions were legally wrong, pointing to her decision to act during a window of time when Rusty was gone and before his mother arrived as evidence of planning and concealment. Dr. Dietz also made a statement during his testimony that would later become highly controversial. He claimed that an episode of the television drama Law and Order had aired shortly before the killings, featuring a plot in which a mother drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity, suggesting that Andrea may have modeled her actions on the fictional scenario. This testimony was later found to be factually incorrect. No such episode had aired, and it became a significant basis for the appeal of Andrea's initial conviction. The jury in the first trial deliberated for approximately 3.5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on March 12, 2002. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder in the deaths of Noah, John, and Mary, and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The verdict was met with fierce criticism from mental health advocates and legal experts who argued that the Texas legal standard for insanity, which required the defendant to prove that they did not know their actions were wrong, had been applied in a way that failed to account for the complexity of psychotic delusion, in which a person can simultaneously know that an action is legally wrong while being so consumed by delusional belief that they are incapable of conforming their behavior to legal standards. The case became a flashpoint in national conversations about the treatment of mentally ill defendants in the criminal justice system, the adequacy of postpartum mental health care, and the responsibilities of family members and medical professionals in recognizing and responding to psychiatric deterioration. In January 2005, the First Court of Appeals in Texas reversed Andrea's conviction on the grounds that Dr. Park Dietz's testimony about the Law and Order episode had been false, and that the false testimony could have influenced the jury. The case was remanded for retrial. The second trial began in June 2006, and this time the outcome was different. On July 26, 2006, the jury found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to North Texas State Hospital in Vernon, Texas, a maximum security psychiatric facility, where she has remained ever since. Unlike a prison sentence, commitment to a state psychiatric hospital under a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict in Texas does not carry a fixed release date. Andrea's continued confinement is reviewed periodically by the courts, and as of the time of this writing, she remains institutionalized, receiving ongoing psychiatric treatment. Her case has continued to generate discussion and scholarly analysis in the years since her second trial, cited frequently in academic literature on postpartum psychosis, filicide, and the insanity defense. Rusty Yates divorced Andrea in 2005 while she was awaiting retrial, and he subsequently remarried and had more children. Andrea, by all accounts from those who work with her at the hospital, spends her days attending religious services, doing crafts, and living within the structured environment of the facility. She has expressed remorse for what she did, though the precise nature of her ongoing psychological state and her full understanding of what occurred on that June morning in 2001 remains a matter known only to her treating physicians and those close to her case. The 5 children she killed, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, were buried together, and their deaths remain among the most devastating examples in modern American history of what can happen when severe mental illness goes undertreated, when warning signs are ignored, and when a system belief, however sincerely held, becomes the instrument of unimaginable tragedy. The case of Andrea Yates did not merely shock the nation. It forced the nation to confront deeply uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the nature of illness, and whether those two things can exist in the same person at the same time, questions that courts, psychiatrists, and ordinary people are still wrestling with today. Number 2, Susan Smith, the mother who strapped her 2 young sons into a car and sent them to the bottom of a South Carolina lake while the nation searched for a fictional kidnapper. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small town of approximately 10,000 people nestled in the Piedmont region of the state, where everybody knew everybody and the rhythms of daily life were shaped by church, family, and the kind of close community ties that made personal tragedy feel like collective loss. Susan's early childhood was marked by instability and pain, that went far deeper than the surface of the quiet town around her would have suggested. Her parents, Harry Ray Vaughan and Linda Harrison, divorced when Susan was 6 years old, an event that shattered the domestic stability she had known and introduced into her young life a sense of abandonment and emotional insecurity that psychologists who later studied her case would identify as foundational to understanding the woman she became. The divorce was difficult enough, but what followed was far worse. In 1978, when Susan was just 7 years old, her father, Harry, died by suicide, shooting himself in what was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The loss of her father in such a traumatic and sudden manner left scars on Susan that those who knew her intimately said never fully healed. And the grief of that loss was compounded by what came next when her mother, Linda, remarried a man named Beverly Russell, a prominent figure in Union County, who was active in the local Republican Party and the Christian Coalition, a man whose public persona as a community leader and man of faith stood in grotesque contrast to what was happening behind closed doors. Beverly Russell began sexually abusing Susan when she was approximately 15 years old, a fact that Susan disclosed years later, and that Russell himself ultimately admitted to, though the full extent and duration of the abuse remained a matter of painful and contested testimony. The abuse continued into Susan's adulthood, and investigators and psychologists who examined Susan's history noted that the combination of her father's abandonment through suicide, the sexual abuse by her stepfather, and the absence of adequate therapeutic intervention during her formative years created a psychological profile defined by deep-seated needs for love and validation, an intense fear of rejection and abandonment, and a pattern of seeking emotional security through romantic relationships in ways that were often self-destructive and destabilizing. Susan attended Union High School, where she was by most accounts a popular and outwardly cheerful student, involved in clubs and activities and well-liked by her peers. She was elected to the student council and participated in academic programs, maintaining the appearance of a well-adjusted young woman navigating a difficult home life with remarkable composure. It was during her high school years that she met David Smith, a young man from the same community, and the two began a relationship that moved quickly and with the intensity characteristic of two young people seeking in each other the emotional anchoring that their individual circumstances had denied them. Susan became pregnant, and she and David married on March 15, 1991, when Susan was 19 years old. Their first son, Michael Daniel Smith, was born on October 10, 1991. A healthy boy whose arrival seemed to bring Susan genuine joy and a sense of purpose that those around her had not always seen in her. Their second son, Alexander Tyler Smith, known as Alex, was born on August 5, 1993, and for a period the young family appeared to be building something stable and real in their small South Carolina town. But the marriage between Susan and David was trouble from the beginning, marked by mutual infidelities, financial stress, and the kind of communication failures that accumulate over time into irreparable fractures. Both Susan and David were unfaithful to each other during the marriage, and the emotional volatility that characterized their relationship took a toll on both of them. They separated and ultimately divorced in 1993, though they remained connected by their shared children and by the inescapable smallness of their community. After the divorce, Susan began a relationship with Tom Finley, a wealthy and socially prominent young man whose father owned the Conso International Textile Company, one of the larger employers in Union County. Tom Finley represented to Susan everything she had spent her life reaching toward: stability, social standing, financial security, and the validation of being chosen by someone the community admired and respected. The relationship was intense from Susan's perspective, though Tom's feelings appear to have been considerably more measured. In late October 1994, Tom Finley wrote Susan a letter ending their relationship, citing among his reasons his reluctance to take on the responsibility of raising another man's children. The letter was a devastating blow to Susan, striking precisely at the fear of abandonment that had defined her psychology since childhood, and those who have analyzed the timeline of events in the weeks and days that followed have noted that the receipt of that letter appears to have set in motion a cascade of emotional and psychological deterioration that culminated in the events of October 25, 1994. It is impossible to know with certainty what was happening inside Susan Smith's mind in the days between receiving that letter and the night she drove to John D. Long Lake. But the trajectory of her actions and the statements she made in the aftermath paint a picture of a woman consumed by desperation, grief and profound and catastrophic failure of moral reasoning in the face of overwhelming emotional pain. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith buckled her two sons into their car seats in the back of her burgundy 1990 Mazda protege, Michael, who was 3 years old, in his car seat, and Alex, who was 14 months old, in his infant seat, and drove to the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, a rural recreational area approximately 13 miles outside of Union. What happened at that boat ramp in the darkness of that October night has been established through physical evidence, Susan's own confession, and the reconstruction of events by investigators from a Union County Sheriff's Office. Susan drove the car to the edge of the boat ramp, put it in neutral, got out of the vehicle, and released it. The Mazda rolled down the ramp and into the lake, carrying Michael and Alex with it. The car entered the water and sank. Michael and Alex Smith, strapped into their car seats, drowned. The medical examiner later determined that the boys likely survived for a brief period as the car filled with water, a detail so agonizing that it became one of the most emotionally unbearable elements of a case already saturated with grief. Susan stood at the edge of the lake, and then she drove away. What followed over the next 9 days was one of the most extraordinary and disturbing spectacles in American criminal history, a performance of grief and desperation so convincing that it deceived not only the nation watching from her television screens, but also the law enforcement officers charged with finding her children. Susan drove to a nearby house and knocked on the door, telling the residents who answered that a black man had carjacked her vehicle at a stoplight with her children inside. The description she gave was specific: a black male in his late 20s to early 30s, wearing a dark knit cap and a plaid shirt, who had forced her out of the car at gunpoint and driven away with her sons. The story triggered one of the largest missing children investigations in South Carolina history. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells, a man who had known Susan personally for years and who genuinely cared about finding the two boys he believed had been taken, threw the full resources of his department into the search. The FBI was called in. Roadblocks were established. Flyers bearing the faces of Michael and Alex Smith were distributed across the state and then across the country. The story made national news almost immediately, and Susan Smith became the center of a media storm, appearing on television programs, including the Today Show, to plead for the return of her children. Her appearances were watched by millions, and the sight of a young mother weeping and begging for her sons provoked an outpouring of sympathy and grief from the American public that was as genuine as it was heartbreaking, because the public did not yet know what Susan knew about where her children were. The investigation, however, was generating quiet doubts among some of the law enforcement officers working the case. Sheriff Wells and the FBI agents assigned to the investigation noticed inconsistencies in Susan's account that accumulated slowly but steadily over days of a search. The traffic light where Susan claimed the carjacking occurred was on a timer that evening, and investigators determined that it had been green at the time Susan said it turned red, raising questions about the fundamental logistics of her account. Witnesses in the area did not report seeing a vehicle matching Susan's description being driven by a black man, and Susan's emotional responses during interviews, while superficially convincing, struck some experienced investigators as subtly off in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The racial dimension of Susan's false accusation was not lost on the black community of Union County and South Carolina more broadly, and civil rights leaders raised immediate concerns about the way in which Susan had deployed a racist stereotype, the dangerous black male criminal, as a shield for her deception, a concern that proved tragically well-founded, and that added a layer of social and racial injury to the already devastating human toll of the case. Throughout the 9 days of the investigation, Sheriff Wells maintained a careful and methodical approach, building trust with Susan while quietly closing the net around her account. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after the supposed carjacking, Sheriff Wells sat down with Susan Smith for what became the final interview before her confession. He confronted her with the inconsistencies in her account directly and compassionately, telling her that he knew she was not telling the truth and that whatever had happened, she needed to tell him. Susan Smith broke. She confessed that she had driven to John D. Long Lake, released her car into the water, and left her sons inside it. The search teams that had been scouring the region for a black carjacker were redirected to John D. Long Lake. On November 3, 1994, divers entered the water at the boat ramp and located the submerged Mazda approximately 18 feet below the surface. Michael and Alex Smith were still inside, still strapped into their car seats. The recovery of their bodies was witnessed by members of the community who had gathered at the lake, and the grief that erupted in Union County that evening was described by those who were present as unlike anything they'd ever experienced, a communal wail of sorrow and disbelief that echoed through the small town for days. The nation, which had been following the story with a desperate hope that the two boys would be found alive, absorbed the news with a collective sense of shock and betrayal that transformed the Susan Smith case from a story about a mother's grief into a story about a mother's guilt. And the transition was savage in its psychological impact on the American public. Susan was arrested immediately following her confession and charged with 2 counts of murder. The community that had rallied around her, that had worn ribbons and held prayer vigils and donated to search funds, was now confronting the reality that the woman they had grieved alongside had been the one responsible for the death of the children they had been trying to find. The trial of Susan Smith began on July 17, 1995, before Judge William Howard in Union County, South Carolina. The prosecution was led by Solicitor Tommy Pope, who argued that Susan Smith had deliberately and premeditatedly murdered her children in order to remove what she perceived as the primary obstacle to her relationship with Tom Finley, whose letter ending their relationship had cited her children as a reason he could not commit to her. The prosecution's theory was one of cold and calculated selfishness, a mother who weighed the lives of her children against the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man and made a monstrous choice. The defense, led by attorneys David Bruck and Judy Clark, both of whom were experienced capital defense lawyers, did not dispute that Susan had killed her children. Instead, they argued that the jury should spare her life, presenting extensive evidence about her history of childhood sexual abuse, her father's suicide, her untreated depression, and the psychological devastation wrought by years of trauma and inadequate care. Beverly Russell, Susan's stepfather, took the stand during the sentencing phase and admitted that he had sexually abused Susan, a confession that was both legally significant and publicly stunning, given his profile as a community and religious leader. The defense argued that Susan was a deeply damaged woman who had committed an act of devastating violence in a moment of psychological crisis, and that executing her would compound tragedy with tragedy without serving any meaningful purpose of justice. The jury deliberated for approximately 2.5 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on both counts of murder on July 22, 1995. The sentencing phase then began, with the same jury tasked with deciding between the death penalty and life in prison. After deliberating for approximately 90 minutes, the jury returned a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Susan Smith was 30 years old at the time of her conviction, meaning she would first become eligible for parole in 2025. The decision to spare her life was received with mixed reactions in Union County and across the country. Some felt that the jury had shown appropriate mercy in light of Susan's traumatic history, while others felt that the magnitude of what she had done to her children demanded the ultimate penalty. Tom Finley, whose letter had played such a central role in the prosecution's theory of the case, testified during the trial and maintained a notably low profile in the years that followed. David Smith, the father of Michael and Alex, has spoken publicly about his sons over the years, established a foundation in their memory, and written about the experience of losing them in a way so doubly devastating to violence and to their mother's hand. Susan Smith has been incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, since her conviction in 1995. Her time in prison has not been without incident. In 2000, it was reported that she had engaged in sexual relationships with 2 correctional officers, resulting in disciplinary action against the officers involved. The reports were widely covered in the press and reignited public anger towards Susan, with many people feeling that the circumstances of her incarceration were insufficiently punitive given the nature of her crime. She became eligible for parole for the first time in 2025, and the question of whether she should ever be released has been the subject of renewed public debate, with victim advocates and members of the public arguing forcefully that no parole should be granted, while others point to the decades she has served and the complex psychological circumstances of her crime. David Smith has stated publicly that he opposes her release. The bodies of Michael and Alex Smith are buried in Bogensville United Methodist Church Cemetery in Union, South Carolina, where their graves have become a place of quiet pilgrimage for people who remember the case and the two small boys whose faces were on flyers across the country during those 9 days in the autumn of 1994. The case of Susan Smith remains one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally devastating filicide cases in American history, a story not simply about a mother who killed her children, but about the long and destructive trail of trauma, abuse, abandonment, and inadequate intervention that preceded that night at John D. Long Lake, and about the catastrophic human cost when all those forces converge in a single moment of irreversible violence. Number 3. Diane Downs, the mother who shot her 3 children on a dark Oregon road, killed one, and then calmly drove him to hospital while blaming a stranger. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, the eldest child of Wilda and Wes Fredrickson, and from the earliest years of her life, she occupied a psychological and emotional landscape defined by contradiction. A girl who craved attention and admiration with an intensity that those around her found alternately charming and unsettling, who possessed a sharp intelligence and a gift for self-presentation that could make her enormously appealing in social settings, and who harbored beneath that appealing surface a profound and consuming self-centeredness that would manifest in increasingly destructive ways as she grew older. Her childhood was not characterized by the overt trauma that marked the early lives of some of the other women whose stories intersect with hers in the annals of American true crime. There was no documented sexual abuse, no parent loss to suicide, no catastrophic rupture of the domestic world. But those who have studied her case and the psychological evaluations conducted in the years surrounding her trial have noted that Diane exhibited from a young age the traits associated with narcissistic personality disorder, including a grandiose sense of her own importance and desirability, a lack of empathy for others, a pattern of manipulating relationships to serve her own needs, and an inability to tolerate situations in which she was not the central focus of attention and admiration. These traits were present in childhood and adolescence and intensified throughout her adult life in ways that made her personal relationships volatile, her professional interactions complicated, and her capacity for genuine emotional connection with others, including ultimately her own children, deeply and dangerously limited. Diane attended high school in Arizona and was by accounts a striking young woman who was acutely aware of the effect her appearance had on others and who used that awareness strategically in her social interactions. She married Stephen Downs when she was relatively young, and the marriage produced 3 children: Christy, born in 1974, Cheryl, born in 1976, and Danny, born in 1979. The family lived in Arizona, where Diane worked for the United States Postal Service as a mail carrier, a job she performed competently and that gave her a degree of financial independence and social interaction that she valued. The marriage to Stephen Downs was troubled from the beginning, marked by Diane's infidelities and her restless dissatisfaction with constraints of domestic life, and the couple divorced, a separation that left Diane as the primary caretaker of Christy, Cheryl, and Danny while she continued her work with the Postal Service and pursued romantic relationships with a series of men who would come to play significant roles in the narrative that led to the night of May 19, 1983. The most consequential of those relationships was a married man named Robert Knickerbocker, known to those close to him as Lou, whom Diane met through her work and with whom she became deeply and obsessively involved in the years leading up to the crime. Lou Knickerbocker was, by Diane's own account and by the account of investigators who examined the relationship, unwilling to leave his wife and fully commit to Diane, a situation that Diane found simultaneously maddening and compelling, because the unavailability of the men she desired most seemed to intensify rather than diminish her attachment to them. The relationship with Knickerbocker was characterized by the kind of emotional volatility that tends to emerge when one person is far more invested than the other, and Diane's investment in Knickerbocker was total in a way that left little room for her to invest genuinely in anything or anyone else, including her children. In 1982, Diane made the decision to relocate to Oregon, a move that was connected in part to her desire to follow Knickerbocker, who had moved to the Cottage Grove area of Lane County, and in part to a general restlessness and desire for reinvention that was characteristic of the way she moved through her life. She transferred her Postal Service position to a route in the Springfield and Eugene area, settled with her 3 children into a life in Lane County, and continued her pursuit of Knickerbocker with an intensity that people who knew her during this period described as all-consuming. Knickerbocker continued to resist committing fully to Diane, and the frustration of that resistance became a defining feature of her emotional life during the months leading up to May 1983. Investigators and psychologists who later examined the case developed a theory about what happened on the night of May 19, 1983, that centered on this relationship and on Diane's fundamental unwillingness to accept any obstacle to the future she constructed in her imagination. The theory, supported by substantial evidence, was that Diane had come to believe, or had convinced herself, that her children were the primary obstacle to Knickerbocker fully committing to her, that a man willing to leave his wife might nonetheless be deterred by the prospect of inheriting 3 young children, and that eliminating the children would eliminate the obstacle. Whether this reasoning was as cold and deliberate as it appeared, or whether it was the product of a disordered and narcissistic mind that had simply ceased to register the humanity of her own offspring, is a question that has been debated by criminologists and psychologists ever since. But the physical evidence of what happened on that rural Oregon road in the spring of 1983 left very little room for alternative interpretations. On the evening of May 19, 1983, Diane Downs drove with her 3 children, Christy, who was 8 years old, Cheryl, who was 7, and Danny, who was 3, along Old Mohawk Road in rural Lane County, Oregon, a dark and sparsely traveled stretch of road that wound to the forested countryside east of Springfield. At some point during that drive, the children were shot. Christy was shot in the chest. Cheryl was shot in the chest. Danny was shot in the chest. The weapon used was a .22 caliber pistol. Cheryl Downs, 7 years old, died from her wound. Christy survived but suffered a stroke as a result of blood loss that left her with permanent disabilities, including partial paralysis on her left side. Danny survived but sustained nerve damage to his arm that resulted in permanent paralysis of that limb. After the shooting, Diane drove her 3 wounded children, one of whom was already dying, one of whom was in critical condition, and one of whom was severely injured, not immediately to the nearest emergency services, but along a route that took approximately 6 minutes longer than the most direct path to McKenzie-Willamette Hospital in Springfield, where she arrived at approximately 10:30 in the evening. The emergency room staff who received the family that night were confronted with a scene of horrifying chaos. 3 children with gunshot wounds, one of whom had no pulse, and mother whose demeanor struck virtually every medical professional present as profoundly, disturbingly wrong. The nurses and doctors who treated the children that night later testified at trial about their observations of Diane's behavior in the emergency room, and their testimony was among the most chilling elements of a deeply chilling case. Rather than the frantic, hysterical, disintegrating grief that medical staff typically witnessed in parents of critically injured children, Diane was calm, not the stunned calm of shock, but an active, engaged, almost performative calm that included making conversation with staff, appearing composed and self-possessed, and at one point being observed to check her appearance in a reflective surface. One nurse testified that Diane had seemed more interested in recounting her story to investigators than in the condition of her children, and that when staff informed her that Cheryl had died, her reaction was notably muted in a way that struck the nurse as deeply incongruous with the magnitude of the loss. Diane told the investigators who responded to McKenzie-Willamette Hospital that she had been driving along Old Mohawk Road when a shaggy-haired stranger had stepped into the road and flagged her down. She said that when she stopped, the man had approached the car, demanded her keys, and when she refused, had shot through the window at the children in the back seat before she managed to drive away. The description she gave of the stranger was detailed enough to generate a composite sketch, but vague enough to resist easy identification. A young man, shaggy hair, a particular kind of jacket, presenting the kind of specificity that suggests invention rather than memory. The story had the surface architecture of plausibility, rural road, late evening, isolated location, but it had the deeper problem of being almost entirely unsupported by physical evidence. The investigation was led by detectives from the Lane County Sheriff's Office, including Detective Doug Welch, who became one of the primary figures in the case and whose methodical, patient approach to building the evidentiary case against Diane Downs was later credited as central to the successful prosecution. The physical evidence of the scene was inconsistent with Diane's account in several significant ways. The blood evidence in and around the car did not match the pattern that would have resulted from a shooter firing through the window from outside the vehicle. The distribution of blood and the trajectories of the wounds suggested strongly that the shots had been fired from inside the car at close range, with the shooter positioned in or near the driver's seat. There was no physical evidence of a struggle at the roadside of the kind that would have accompanied the confrontation Diane described. No footprints in the soft ground beside the road that could be attributed to the alleged stranger. No forensic trace of an unknown person having been present at the scene. The .22 caliber pistol that Diane reported had been used by the stranger was never found at the scene, but investigators established that Diane had recently owned a .22 caliber pistol that she was unable to produce for investigators when asked to do so, eventually claiming that it had been stolen from her. A firearms examiner later testified that spent casings recovered from Diane's car were consistent with having been fired from a specific type of .22 caliber weapon that matched the model Diane had previously owned. As the investigation progressed through the spring and summer of 1983, Diane continued to present herself publicly as a grieving mother falsely accused, giving interviews to local media in which she spoke about Cheryl's death and the injuries to Christy and Danny with a composure and articulateness that some viewers found admirable and others found deeply troubling. She became, in a local and then national sense, a figure of considerable public fascination, a young, attractive, articulate woman who told a vivid story of roadside violence and maternal courage, and whose apparent steadiness in the face of tragedy was either evidence of extraordinary resilience or evidence of something far darker. And Rule, the true crime author who had previously written about Ted Bundy, a man she had known personally, became interested in the Diane Downs case and embedded herself in the reporting and investigation process, eventually producing the book Small Sacrifices, published in 1987, which became one of the defining accounts of the case and one of the most successful true crime books ever written. Rule's access to investigators, court records, and people who knew Diane gave her account a depth and authority that made it enormously influential in shaping public understanding of who Diane Downs was and what she had done, and the book's title, taken from Diane's own chilling statement that a person had to make small sacrifices in life, encapsulated with devastating precision the psychological core of the case. Christy Downs, who had survived a shooting and who was slowly recovering from the stroke and its aftermath, became a critical witness in the investigation in a way that was both legally significant and deeply poignant. As Christy's condition stabilized and her ability to communicate improved, investigators working with her in careful, age-appropriate ways determined that she was able to provide information about what had happened on Old Mohawk Road. Her communications with investigators, conducted with the assistance of medical and child psychology professionals, pointed away from the stranger Diane had described and toward Diane herself as the shooter, a development that was devastating to Diane's account and transformative for the prosecution's case. The decision about how and whether to use Christy's testimony at trial was one of the most delicate and fraught aspects of the prosecution's preparation, given Christy's age, her injuries, her ongoing recovery, and the profound psychological complexity of asking a child to testify against her mother in a murder trial. Christy ultimately did testify, and her testimony was among the most emotionally powerful moments in a trial already saturated with emotional weight. The trial of Diane Downs began on May 10, 1984, before Judge Gregory Foote in Lane County Circuit Court in Eugene, Oregon. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Fred Hughey, who had developed profound personal investment in the case through his work with Christy and Danny during the investigation period, an investment that extended beyond professional duty into genuine care for the children's well-being, and that he and his wife eventually formalized by becoming Christy and Danny's foster parents and later their adoptive parents. Hughey's decision to adopt the surviving children of the woman he was prosecuting was unusual and was scrutinized both at the time and in subsequent years. But those who knew and maintained that it reflected the depth of his commitment to Christy and Danny's welfare rather than any improper motivation. The prosecution's case rested on the physical evidence inconsistent with Diane's account. The firearms evidence connecting the wound patterns to a shooter inside the vehicle, Christy's testimony, and extensive evidence about Diane's relationship with Lou Knickerbocker and the theory that she had shot her children to remove them as obstacles to that relationship. Expert testimony about the forensic evidence was presented in careful and accessible detail, and the prosecution built a case that was circumstantial in some respects but overwhelming in its cumulative weight. The defense mounted by Diane's attorney, Jim Jagger, challenged the physical evidence, questioned the reliability of Christy's testimony, given her age and the circumstances under which it had been obtained, and presented Diane herself as a witness, a decision that gave the prosecution the opportunity to cross-examine her extensively and that many legal observers later identified as a strategic error because Diane's performance on the stand, while confident and articulate, displayed precisely the self-absorbed and affect-flattened qualities that had troubled observers throughout the case. Her willingness to speak at length about herself, her relationship with Knickerbocker, and her sense of grievance at being accused struck jurors and observers as deeply inconsistent with the emotional state of a mother who had lost one child to violence and nearly lost two others. During the trial, it also emerged that Diane had become pregnant while the case was pending, having conceived a child that she subsequently offered for adoption, an act that prosecutors and observers characterized as emblematic of her treatment of children as objects whose value was contingent on their usefulness to her own emotional and relational needs. On June 17, 1984, after deliberating for approximately 2.5 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: 1 count of murder for the death of Cheryl Downs, 2 counts of attempted murder for the shootings of Christy and Danny, and 1 count of first-degree assault. Diane Downs was sentenced by Judge Foote to life in prison plus 50 years, a sentence intended to ensure that she would never be released. She was transported to the Oregon Women's Correctional Center to begin serving her sentence. In 1987, Diane Downs escaped from the correctional facility, a breach of security that sent shockwaves through the Oregon Department of Corrections and the broader criminal justice system. She was recaptured 10 days later at a house in Tijeras, New Mexico, where she had been hiding with a man she had met through correspondence while incarcerated. The escape attempt and subsequent capture added another chapter to a case that had already generated more public fascination than almost any other in Oregon history, and it reinforced the assessment of those who had evaluated Diane psychologically, that she was a woman of considerable intelligence and resourcefulness who operated entirely in service of her own needs and desires without meaningful regard for rules, boundaries, or the consequences of her actions for others. Diane Downs has appeared before the Oregon Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision multiple times since becoming eligible, and she has been denied parole at each hearing. The parole board has consistently cited the nature of her crimes, her psychological profile, and concerns about the risk she would pose to the community as reasons for denial. She has maintained throughout her incarceration that she is innocent, that a stranger did shoot her children on Old Mohawk Road, and that she has been a victim of a prosecution built on fabricated evidence and the corrupted testimony of a child. Christy Downs, who was adopted by Fred Hughey and his wife and raised in a loving home, grew up, married, and built a life for herself, a testament to resilience that those familiar with the case have pointed to as one of the very few redemptive elements in an otherwise unrelentingly dark story. Danny Downs also survived, living with the permanent disabilities caused by the shooting. Cheryl Downs, who was 7 years old when she died on May 19, 1983, from a gunshot wound inflicted by her mother on a dark Oregon road, is buried in Lane County, and her grave is a quiet and permanent reminder of the child whose life was taken not by a shaggy-haired stranger on a rural road, but by the woman who was supposed to love and protect her above all others. The case of Diane Downs remains one of the most extensively documented and analyzed filicide cases in American criminal history, studied in law schools, psychology programs, and true crime scholarship alike as a defining example of what narcissistic personality disorder looks like when it reaches its most catastrophic and irreversible expression. Number 4, Casey Anthony, the young Florida mother whose 2-year-old daughter Caylee vanished for 31 days before anyone called the police, and whose trial became the most watched and most debated criminal proceeding of its generation. Casey Marie Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, the second child of George and Cindy Anthony, a couple who relocated their family to the Orlando, Florida area when Casey was still young, and who built what appeared from the outside to be a stable, comfortable, middle-class life in the suburban community of Orlando that would eventually become the backdrop for one of the most sensational criminal cases in American history. George Anthony was a former law enforcement officer who had worked in homicide investigation, a detail that would become deeply significant in the context of what his family later alleged and what prosecutors later disputed. And Cindy Anthony was a nurse whose professional competence and organizational precision were qualities she brought to management of her household with an intensity that those who knew the family described as occasionally suffocating. The dynamic between Cindy and Casey was, by virtually every account from people who knew them, deeply complicated and frequently combative, characterized by the kind of enmeshment and conflict that emerges when controlling parent and a resistant child are locked in a relationship neither fully understands nor knows how to navigate. Casey grew up in the Anthony household alongside her older brother Lee, attended school in the Orlando area, and presented herself to the outside world as a sociable, attractive young woman who was well-liked by her peers and who moved through social environments with ease and confidence that masked, according to those who later examined her psychology, a profound and deeply rooted dishonesty that had been present since her adolescence and that expressed itself in a pattern of fabrications, manipulations, and deceptions that grew more elaborate and more consequential as she got older. Casey attended Colonial High School in Orlando, where she was an average student who was more interested in her social life than her academic performance, and it was during her high school years that the pattern of lying that would later define her public profile began to manifest in ways that concerned those closest to her. She told friends and family members stories about her life that did not check out, about jobs she did not have, about experiences she had not had, about relationships that were not what she described them to be, and when confronted about these fabrications, she demonstrated an ability to maintain her invented narrative with composure and conviction that those who later studied her case identified as a hallmark of pathological dishonesty. She did not graduate from Colonial High School, failing to complete the credits required for her diploma, in a fact that she concealed from her parents for an extended period by pretending to attend classes she was no longer enrolled in, a deception that in retrospect reads as a small-scale preview of the far more consequential deceptions that lay ahead. In 2004, when Casey was 18 years old, she became pregnant. The father of the child was a young man named Jesse Grund, though the paternity was initially uncertain and was later established through DNA testing. The pregnancy was not planned, and the dynamics surrounding it within the Anthony family were complicated, with Cindy's initial reaction reportedly one of significant distress before she recalibrated and embraced the coming grandchild with an enthusiasm that some observers felt gradually shifted the balance of the household in ways that created new friction between Cindy and Casey. Caylee Marie Anthony was born on August 9, 2005, a healthy and by all accounts delightful little girl whose photographs, bright eyes, dark hair, a smile of extraordinary warmth, would later be reproduced on flyers and television screens across the country in a way that made her face one of the most recognizable in America. Casey was 19 years old when Caylee was born, living at home with her parents in a house on Hope Spring Drive in Orlando, and the arrangement that developed in the years following Caylee's birth was one in which Cindy Anthony became deeply involved in Caylee's care and daily life, to the point where the boundaries between grandmother and mother were, in the view of some observers, substantially blurred. Whether this arrangement suited Casey or chafed against her is a matter of interpretation. But what is clear from the accounts of people who knew the family during this period is that Casey's life in the years between Caylee's birth and her disappearance in 2008 was characterized by a widening gulf between the reality of her circumstances and the version of her life she presented to the world. She told people she had a job at Universal Studios that she did not have. She maintained a social life built on relationships with friends who describe her as fun, spontaneous, and consistently dishonest about the details of her life. She had a boyfriend named Tony Lazzaro, a college student with whom she had been in a relationship since the spring of 2008, and with whom she spent a significant amount of time in the weeks surrounding Caylee's disappearance. The relationship between Casey and her daughter, as described by those who observed them together, was by most accounts warm on the surface. Casey appeared to enjoy Caylee's company, took photographs of her frequently, and was affectionate with her in social settings. But the depth of Casey's maternal investment was questioned by those who noted her readiness to leave Caylee with her parents for extended periods while she pursued her social life, and who observed that the persona Casey presented to the world was fundamentally incompatible with the constraints and responsibilities of single motherhood. On June 16, 2008, Casey Anthony left the house on Hope Spring Drive with Caylee. It was the last time Caylee was seen alive by anyone other than Casey. What happened between June 16, 2008 and the morning of July 15, 2008, when Cindy Anthony called 911 to report that her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days, is the central mystery of a case that generated more public debate, more legal commentary, and more raw emotional reaction than almost any other American criminal proceeding since the O.J. Simpson trial. The 31 days between Caylee's last known appearance and the report of her disappearance are documented through a combination of cell phone records, video surveillance footage, witness testimony, and Casey's own statements to investigators. And what that documentation reveals is a picture of Casey Anthony living her life with an absence of visible grief or distress that the prosecution later characterized as consciousness of guilt, and that the defense characterized as a coping mechanism, shaped by a lifetime of trauma and dysfunction. During those 31 days, Casey was photographed at a nightclub called Fusion participating in a hot body contest, smiling and dancing. She was at Tony Lazzaro's apartment frequently. She went to Target. She got a tattoo that read Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life, on her left shoulder, an act that the prosecution highlighted as emblematic of her attitude during the period following Caylee's death. She told her parents, when they asked about Caylee, that the child was with a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, a woman who Casey described in considerable detail and who investigators later determined did not exist in the form Casey described. There was a real woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez in the Orlando area, but she had never met Casey or Caylee and had nothing to do with the child's care. The 31 days came to an end not because Casey came forward, but because Cindy Anthony, growing increasingly alarmed by Casey's evasiveness about Caylee's whereabouts, took matters into her own hands. On July 15, 2008, Cindy located Casey at Tony Lazzaro's apartment and brought her home, and a confrontation ensued in which Cindy demanded to know where Caylee was. Casey continued to maintain the fiction of the nanny, and Cindy, by now genuinely frightened, called 911. The calls Cindy made to 911 on the evening of July 15, 2008, were recorded and were later played extensively during the trial. In one of them, Cindy could be heard telling the dispatcher that her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days and that there was something wrong, that she found her daughter's car and it smelled like there had been a dead body in it. The smell of the car, a 1998 white Pontiac Sunfire that Casey had been driving, became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the subsequent investigation. George Anthony, when he retrieved the car from an impound lot where it had been towed after being abandoned at an Amscot check cashing location, described the smell as immediately and unmistakably recognizable to him from his law enforcement background as the odor of human decomposition. A forensic analyst later testified that testing of a stain in the trunk of the car had revealed the presence of chloroform and the chemical signature associated with human decomposition. The prosecution's theory was that Caylee had died in the trunk of that car. Casey was taken in for questioning by the Orange County Sheriff's Office on July 16, 2008, and the interviews she gave to investigators over the following days were recorded and became central exhibits in the trial. Casey maintained the fiction of Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez with investigators, leading them on a tour of Universal Studios where she claimed to work, eventually admitting, when confronted with the reality, that she had not been employed there for approximately 2 years. She gave investigators detailed descriptions of the nanny and the locations where the nanny had allegedly taken Caylee, all of which were found by investigators to be either fabricated or grossly distorted. The investigation expanded rapidly, with the Orange County Sheriff's Office and the FBI dedicating substantial resources to finding Caylee, who at this stage was still officially classified as a missing child. Searches were conducted throughout the Orlando area. A tip line generated thousands of calls. The case attracted national media attention with a speed that reflected both the public's emotional response to the image of the missing toddler and the growing public suspicion, fed by the details emerging about Casey's behavior during the 31 days, that something far darker than a kidnapping had occurred. On December 11, 2008, a utility meter reader named Roy Kronk was conducting his work in a wooded area near the Anthony family home on Suburban Drive in Orlando, less than a quarter mile from the house on Hope Spring Drive, when he discovered a bag. Inside the bag were skeletal remains. The remains were subsequently identified through DNA analysis as those of Caylee Marie Anthony, who had been 2 years old at the time of her disappearance. The cause of death could not be definitively established by the medical examiner, Dr. Jan Garavaglia, because the remains were fully skeletonized by the time they were discovered, having been in the wooded area for approximately 6 months. Dr. Garavaglia ruled the death a homicide by undetermined means, a ruling that would become a significant point of contention during the trial, as the inability to establish a specific cause of death created a gap in the prosecution's case that the defense would exploit with considerable effectiveness. Duct tape was found in association with the remains and in the area around where the body was discovered. And the prosecution's theory was that duct tape had been placed over Caylee's nose and mouth, causing her death by suffocation, and that Casey had then placed her daughter's body in bags and left it in the wooded area near the family home. Heart-shaped stickers were also found in connection with the duct tape, and investigators noted that similar heart-shaped stickers had been found in the Anthony family home. Casey Anthony was indicted on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The pretrial period was extensive, lasting nearly 3 years and generating a volume of media coverage that few criminal cases in American history have matched. The selection of the defense team, led by Jose Baez, a relatively inexperienced criminal defense attorney who was joined by high-profile attorney Cheney Mason, was itself a subject of considerable public commentary, as was every development in the case from the collection of evidence to the rulings of Judge Belvin Perry, Jr., who presided over proceedings with a firm hand and a commitment to maintaining order in a courtroom that had become the center of a national media event. The trial began on May 24, 2011, and it was televised in its entirety, attracting viewing audiences that rivaled major sporting events and generating a level of public engagement through social media, news commentary, legal analysis programs, and water cooler conversation that made it one of the defining cultural events of 2011. The prosecution, led by lead prosecutor Jeff Ashton along with Linda Drain Burdick and Frank George, built its case around the theory that Casey had used chloroform to render Caylee unconscious and then applied duct tape to her nose and mouth, killing her in order to free herself from the constraints of motherhood and pursue the lifestyle she preferred. Ashton presented computer search evidence showing that the Anthony family computer had been used to search terms including how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and death, searches that the prosecution attributed to Casey and that it argued demonstrated premeditation. The computer evidence was among the most technically complex aspects of the trial, and it was later scrutinized and partially challenged when questions arose about the reliability of the software used to analyze the search history, an issue that became a significant point of post-trial commentary. The forensic evidence included the testimony of Dr. Gravaglia on the cause of death ruling, the testimony of the forensic analyst regarding the trunk stain, and testimony from experts in various fields about the physical evidence collected from the scene where Caylee's remains were found and from the Anthony family home. The prosecution also presented extensive evidence about Casey's behavior during the 31 days, including the nightclub photographs, the Bella Vita tattoo, the video surveillance footage showing her shopping at Target, and the testimony of friends and acquaintances who described her demeanor during that period as normal, cheerful, and entirely inconsistent with that of a mother whose child was missing. The defense strategy, as outlined by Jose Baez in his opening statement, was one of the most startling and controversial in recent American legal history. Baez told the jury in his opening that Caylee had not been murdered, that she had drowned accidentally in the family swimming pool on June 16, 2008, and that George Anthony had discovered the body and, rather than calling emergency services, had disposed of it and coached Casey to cover up the accident. Baez further alleged that George Anthony had sexually abused Casey throughout her childhood and adolescence, and that the pattern of lying and dysfunction that characterized Casey's behavior was the product of a lifetime of trauma and a family culture concealment and denial. George Anthony denied both the abuse allegation and the drowning cover-up story emphatically on the stand, and the prosecution characterized the entire defense narrative as a fabrication constructed to provide an alternative explanation for the evidence without subjecting it to meaningful scrutiny. The sexual abuse allegation was particularly explosive, and the defense's decision to make it a centerpiece of their strategy was controversial among legal observers, many of whom questioned whether it was supported by sufficient evidence and whether it would be persuasive to a jury. Cindy Anthony's testimony became one of the most unexpected and discussed moments of the trial, when she claimed on the stand that she had been the one who had conducted the computer searches for chloroform, stating that she had been searching for information about the plant chlorophyll and had inadvertently searched for chloroform. Employment records subsequently introduced by the prosecution indicated that Cindy had been at work on the days in question, raising the clear implication that she had committed perjury to protect her daughter, an implication that was widely discussed but did not result in a perjury prosecution. After approximately 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on July 4, 2011. The nation waited. The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours over 2 days before returning its verdict on July 5, 2011. Casey Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, and not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child. She was found guilty on all 4 counts of lying to law enforcement. The verdict was met with an immediate and overwhelming public reaction of shock, outrage, and disbelief that expressed itself through social media, news commentary, and public demonstrations outside the courthouse in a way that reflected the depth of the public's emotional investment in the case and its conviction that justice had not been served. Jeff Ashton, who retired from the prosecutor's office shortly after the verdict, wrote a book about the case in which he expressed his own frustration with the outcome. Jose Baez wrote a book presenting his account of the defense strategy and the verdict. The jurors who were interviewed after the verdict explained that while many of them personally believed Casey was responsible for Caylee's death, the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt how Caylee had died, and that in the absence of a proven cause of death, they could not in good conscience convict on the most serious charges. The explanation was legally coherent, but did little to assuage the public's sense of injustice. Casey Anthony was sentenced on July 7, 2011, to 4 years in prison, the maximum for the lying convictions, but received credit for time already served, meaning she was released from the Orange County Jail on July 17, 2011, having served just under 3 years. Her release was conducted in the pre-dawn hours to avoid the crowds that had gathered outside the facility, and she was driven away in a vehicle whose destination was not disclosed. In the years since her release, Casey Anthony has lived a notably obscured existence, making periodic appearances in the public consciousness through documentary projects, interviews, and legal proceedings that have included a civil suit filed by the real Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez and a bankruptcy filing. She has given interviews in which she has discussed the case in her life with a candor that many observers found troubling, and she has maintained positions on what happened to Caylee that have shifted over the years in ways that have been subjected to considerable public analysis. Caylee Marie Anthony is buried at a private location, her family having chosen not to disclose the site publicly in order to protect it from disturbance. She was 2 years old when she died, and the circumstances of her death remain, in the formal legal sense, unresolved, a reality that has made the case of Casey Anthony one of the most enduringly discussed and debated in the history of American criminal justice, a case that raises profound questions not only about what happened on June 16, 2008, in a house in Orlando, Florida, but about the nature of reasonable doubt, the limits of forensic evidence, the reliability of human judgment, and the gap that can exist between what a jury is legally permitted to conclude and what the world outside the courtroom believes to be true. Number 5. Darlie Routier, the Texas mother who staged a brutal home invasion to conceal the murders of her 2 young sons, and whose case has divided public opinion for nearly 3 decades. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the daughter of Larry and Cyrilda Peck, and she grew up in a household that by most accounts was stable and unremarkable in the ways that stable and unremarkable households tend to be, not defined by the dramatic ruptures of abuse or abandonment that characterize the early lives of some of the other women in this series, but shaped instead by the ordinary rhythms of a working-class American family navigating the ordinary challenges of raising children in a mid-sized Pennsylvania city. Darlie was by accounts an attractive and socially confident young woman from an early age, the kind of girl who was comfortable in social settings and who placed considerable value on her appearance, her popularity, and the impression she made on those around her. She was not an exceptional student, but she was well-liked, and she moved through her adolescent years with the easy confidence of someone who had learned early that her looks and her personality were currencies that opened doors and generated goodwill in her social environment. It was during her teenage years in Altoona that she met Darren Routier, a young man who was ambitious, technically minded, and who shared with Darlie a desire for a life defined by material comfort and social success. The two began dating when Darlie was still in high school, and the relationship developed with the intensity and commitment of a young couple who saw in each other the building blocks of the future they both wanted. They married in 1988, when Darlie was 18 years old, and relocated to Texas, first to Lubbock, where Darren pursued business opportunities, and eventually to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where Darren's entrepreneurial ambitions began to find meaningful traction. Darren Routier founded a company called Testneck Incorporated, which provided testing equipment and services to the electronics industry, and in the early 1990s a business grew with a speed that translated directly into the lifestyle Darlie and Darren had envisioned for themselves. They moved into a large, newly constructed home at 5801 Eagle Drive in Rowlett, Texas, a suburban community in Dallas County that represented exactly the kind of upwardly mobile domestic environment they had been working toward: a spacious house in a good neighborhood, nice cars, nice furniture, the visible markers of achievement that both of them valued deeply. Darlie embraced the role of homemaker and mother with enthusiasm, and the couple's first son, Devin, was born in 1989, followed by Damon in 1991. A third son, Drake, was born in 1995, and the family appeared for the outside to be living the life they had planned, successful, comfortable, and growing. Those who knew them during this period described them as a couple who genuinely enjoyed their lifestyle and who were proud of what they had built. And Darlie in particular was known for her attention to her appearance, her love of jewelry and fashion, and her enjoyment of the social dimensions of their relatively affluent suburban existence. She had breast augmentation surgery, drove a nice car, wore expensive jewelry, and by the standards of their community lived well. What was less visible from the outside, and what would only emerge fully in the context of the investigation that followed the events of June 6, 1996, was a degree to which the financial foundation of this comfortable life had been quietly eroding in the months leading up to that night. Darren's business, which had flourished in the early 1990s, had run into serious difficulties by 1995 and into 1996. The company was carrying significant debt. The Routiers had taken out a second mortgage on their home, and the gap between the lifestyle they were maintaining and the financial reality underlying had grown into a chasm that was generating serious stress for both Darren and Darlie. Darlie had reportedly expressed to friends and in her diary feelings of unhappiness and purposelessness in the period leading up to the murders, and investigators later uncovered a diary entry written approximately 2 weeks before the killings in which Darlie wrote about feeling that her family would be better off without her and about thoughts of suicide, a discovery that added a layer of psychological complexity to the case, and that was interpreted differently by different people, by some, as evidence of a deeply troubled woman capable of violence, by others as evidence of a woman in genuine psychological distress who needed help she did not receive. The financial stress, the psychological distress, and the domestic circumstances of the Routier household in the spring of 1996 formed a backdrop against which the events of June 6, 1996 unfolded, though the precise connection between those circumstances and what happened that night has been the subject of sustained and often heated debate in the nearly 3 decades since. On the night of June 5th into the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, the Routier household at 5801 Eagle Drive was arranged in a pattern that had apparently become customary during warm weather. Darren was sleeping upstairs in the master bedroom with the couple's infant son Drake, while Darlie and the 2 older boys, Devin, who was 6 years old, and Damon, who was 5, were sleeping downstairs in the family room, having apparently fallen asleep watching television. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on June 6th, a neighbor named Karen Neal was awakened by the sound of a woman screaming. Darlie Routier called 911 at approximately 2:31 in the morning, and the call, which was recorded and which became one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the case, captured Darlie telling the dispatcher in a voice that combined audible distress with a quality that some investigators and observers later described as a strange undertone of performance, that someone had been in her house, that her children had been stabbed. When police officers arrived at the scene within minutes of the call, they found Devin and Damon Routier on the floor of the family room with stab wounds. Devin, who was 6 years old, had been stabbed twice in the back and once in the chest, and was already dead or dying when officers arrived. Damon, who was 5, had been stabbed twice in the chest and was still alive but in critical condition. He died en route to the hospital. Darlie herself had a wound to her neck and cuts on her arms and hands, and she told the first responding officers the same story she would maintain in the days that followed, that she had been asleep in the family room with her sons when she was awakened by Devin's cries, that she had seen a man or men leaving through the utility room, that she had struggled with an intruder and been cut in the process, and that when she turned back to her sons she found them stabbed. The crime scene, however, told a story that was deeply inconsistent with the home invasion narrative Darlie presented from the first moments of the investigation. The responding officers and the detectives who subsequently processed 5801 Eagle Drive noticed immediately that the scene had the quality of having been arranged rather than genuinely disturbed. A window screen in the utility room through which the intruder was alleged to have entered and exited had been cut, but the cut pattern was inconsistent with a screen that had been breached from outside. The fibers of the screen were deflected in a direction suggesting the cut had been made from inside the house. There was no blood evidence on the windowsill or in the utility room of the kind that would have been expected from an intruder exiting through the window after committing a violent stabbing attack in the family room. A butcher knife from the Routier kitchen was found in the utility room, and it was determined to be the weapon used in the attack, a fact that was consistent with a knife belonging to the household rather than being brought by an intruder. The blood evidence throughout the scene was analyzed extensively by investigators and forensic experts, and the distribution pattern was found to be inconsistent with the movements of an intruder and more consistent with the movements of someone familiar with the layout of the house staging a scene. Perhaps most significantly, a bloody sock was discovered in an alley approximately 75 yards from the house, containing blood that was later identified through DNA testing as belonging to Devin and Damon Routier, but containing no blood from Darlie and no unidentified blood that could be attributed to an intruder. The prosecution's theory was that the bloody sock had been carried to the alley by Darlie or Darren in an attempt to establish the fiction of an intruder fleeing the scene, and that the absence of any forensic trace of an unknown person anywhere in the house or its immediate surroundings was devastating to the home invasion narrative. The investigation was conducted by the Rowlett Police Department in conjunction with the Dallas County Sheriff's Office and involved extensive forensic analysis, witness interviews, and a review of the Routier family's financial circumstances and personal history. Darren Routier was investigated as a potential suspect or co-conspirator in the early stages of the investigation, and the possibility that Darren had participated in or orchestrated the attack was examined carefully before investigators concluded that the evidence pointed most strongly toward Darlie as the sole perpetrator. The financial evidence, the second mortgage, the business debts, the life insurance policies on the children, was examined for potential motive, and while the prosecution did not develop a single, tightly defined motive theory in a way that some true crime cases feature, the circumstantial picture that emerged was one of a household under severe financial and psychological strain, with a mother who had expressed in writing feelings of hopelessness and suicidal ideation, and whose children's deaths were followed not by sustained visible grief, but by behavior that struck investigators, neighbors, and the broader public as profoundly incongruous with the magnitude of the loss. The incongruity of Darlie's behavior in the days following the murders became a defining element of the public's perception of the case when video footage emerged that was filmed by a news crew on June 14, 1996, 8 days after Devin and Damon were killed, at the graveside of the two boys on what would have been Devin's 7th birthday. The footage, which was filmed as a routine news feature on the family visiting the grave, in which Darlie and Darren appeared to welcome as an opportunity to demonstrate their grief publicly, showed Darlie and Darren and other family members at the gravesite, and it included footage of Darlie dancing, spraying silly string over graves of her murdered sons, and laughing with family members in a manner that was so strikingly at odds with what a grieving mother might be expected to display that. When the footage was broadcast, it generated immediate and overwhelming public outrage. The silly string video, as it became known, transformed public opinion about Darlie Routier from a woman who might be a victim into a woman who was almost certainly not. And while the defense argued strenuously at trial that the footage had been selectively edited and that the celebratory behavior had followed a solemn and genuinely grief-stricken portion of the graveside visit that the news crew had not broadcast, the damage to Darlie's public image and, arguably, to her standing with the jury was substantial and lasting. Darlie Routier was charged with capital murder in the death of Damon Routier. The prosecution chose to try her for Damon's murder first, reserving the option to try her for Devin's murder subsequently if necessary. The trial began on January 6, 1997, in Kerrville, Texas, having been moved from Dallas County on a change of venue motion granted because of extensive and largely negative pretrial publicity in the Dallas area. Judge Mark Tolley presided over the proceedings. The prosecution was led by prosecutors Greg Davis and Toby Shook, who built their case around the forensic evidence inconsistent with a home invasion, the bloody sock, the financial circumstances of the Routier household, the diary entries expressing suicidal ideation, and the silly string video. The defense, led by attorney Doug Mulder, a highly experienced Dallas criminal defense lawyer who had represented other high-profile defendants, challenged the forensic evidence, argued that the investigation had been conducted with a predetermined conclusion and that evidence had been interpreted through that lens, and presented Darlie as a loving mother who had been victimized by a real intruder and then re-victimized by a flawed investigation. The defense called forensic experts who challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the blood evidence and the wound evidence, and Darren Routier testified in support of his wife, maintaining that he had heard nothing from upstairs during the attack and that he believed Darlie's account of what had happened. The forensic testimony at the trial was extensive and technically complex, and the competing expert interpretations offered by the prosecution and defense experts on issues ranging from the directionality of blood spatter to the nature of Darlie's neck wound created a battle of experts that jurors were required to evaluate and weigh against each other. The neck wound was a particularly significant point of contention. Darlie's neck wound was deep, close enough to her carotid artery that the emergency room physician who treated her testified that it had come within 2 millimeters of being fatal. The defense argued that no one staging a scene would inflict a wound so close to a major artery on herself, that the proximity of the wound to the carotid was evidence that the attack had been genuine, and that Darlie had narrowly escaped being killed alongside her sons. The prosecution countered that the wound, while serious, was positioned in a way that suggested it had been self-inflicted by someone with sufficient knowledge and control to make it look serious without actually severing the artery, and that its location was consistent with self-inflicted wound designed to support a false narrative of struggle with an intruder. The prosecution also presented testimony from a forensic expert regarding the absence of the kind of arterial blood spray pattern on Darlie's clothing and body that would have been expected if she had been present and struggling with an attacker during the stabbing of her sons, an absence the expert characterized as inconsistent with her claimed proximity to the attacks. After approximately 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury, which deliberated for approximately 7 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on February 1st, 1997. Darlie Lynn Routier was convicted of capital murder in the death of 5-year-old Damon Routier. The penalty phase of the trial followed immediately, and after approximately 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a sentence of death. Darlie Routier was transported to the Mountain View Unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice in Gatesville, Texas, which houses female death row inmates, where she has remained ever since. The case did not end with the conviction. In the nearly 3 decades since the verdict, the Darlie Routier case has become one of the most persistently contested capital cases in American history, attracting the sustained attention of innocence advocates, true crime researchers, legal scholars, and members of the public who have examined the evidence and concluded either that the conviction was just or that it was a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. The controversy has been fueled by several factors, including questions about the reliability of some of the forensic evidence presented at trial, concerns about the conduct of the investigation, and the handling of certain pieces of physical evidence, and the persistent advocacy of Darren Routier, who has maintained his wife's innocence throughout the years since the verdict and who has worked with attorneys and investigators to develop and present new evidence in support of her appeals. Among the issues raised in post-conviction proceedings are questions about the testing and interpretation of the blood spatter evidence, the reliability of the forensic analysis of the bloody sock, the adequacy of Darlie's trial representation on certain issues, and the availability of new forensic testing techniques that were not available at the time of the original trial. DNA testing of the bloody sock and other evidence items has been sought and in some cases conducted in post-conviction proceedings, with results that have been interpreted differently by the prosecution and the defense. A luminol testing issue that emerged in post-conviction proceedings raised questions about additional blood evidence at the scene that had not been fully disclosed or examined during the original trial, and this issue became a significant basis for one of Darlie's appellate claims. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which serves as the state's highest court for criminal matters, has reviewed Darlie's case multiple times and has denied relief on all claims to date, but the appeals process has not been exhausted and litigation in her case continues. Darlie Routier has given interviews from death row in which she has maintained her innocence consistently and with considerable emotional force, describing in detail her account of what happened on the night of June 6, 1996, and expressing anguish at the loss of her sons alongside her insistence that she did not kill them. Darren Routier has remarried and his ongoing public advocacy for his former wife's innocence has itself been a subject of considerable public interest and debate, with some observers finding his continued belief in her compelling and others questioning it. Darlie Routier, who was 6 years old, and Damon Routier, who was 5, are buried in Rowlett, Texas, and their deaths remain the central human reality of a case that has generated more legal controversy, more public debate, and more sustained disagreement about guilt and innocence than almost any other capital case in Texas history. Whether Darlie Routier murdered her sons on the night of June 6, 1996, or whether she was a victim of a genuine home invasion, who was then failed by an investigation that reached its conclusion too quickly and built its case around that conclusion rather than following the evidence wherever it led. That question has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction in the nearly 30 years since 2 small boys were found dying on the floor of their family room in a quiet suburban house in Rowlett, Texas, and it is a question that the Texas criminal justice system may yet be required to answer again before the case of Darlie Routier reaches its final chapter. Number 6, Debora Green, the Kansas physician who poisoned her husband with ricin and set her house on fire with her children inside, killing 2 of them in an act of destruction so total it seemed designed to erase everything her life had become. Debora Jones was born on June 10, 1951, in Sedalia, Missouri, a mid-sized town in the west-central part of the state, and she grew up in circumstances that by the standards of the time and place were solidly middle-class and conventionally aspirational. A household in which education was valued, achievement was expected, and the markers of a successful future were defined in the clear and legible terms of professional accomplishment and social respectability. From an early age, Debora demonstrated a kind of academic ability that sets certain children apart from their peers in ways that are simultaneously a gift and a burden. An intelligence that was genuine, wide-ranging, and formidable, combined with a driven perfectionism that tends to accompany high ability when it develops in an environment that measures worth primarily through performance. She excelled in school with the kind of consistency that made her academic trajectory feel inevitable rather than effortful, and she went on to pursue medicine, entering medical school with the ambition and intellectual firepower to succeed in one of the most demanding professional environments that exists. She earned her medical degree and became a physician, specializing in internal medicine and eventually developing expertise in oncology, the branch of medicine concerned with the diagnosis and treatment of cancer, a specialty that demands not only technical knowledge, but a particular kind of emotional endurance, the capacity to accompany patients and families through experiences of suffering and mortality that would break less resilient people. That Debora Green chose oncology and excelled within it was, in the years before everything collapsed, a testament to a professional identity built on genuine competence and the kind of intellectual engagement with difficult problems that had defined her since childhood. It was during her medical training that Debora met Michael Farrar, a man who was himself pursuing a career in medicine and who possessed the kind of intelligence, ambition, and professional drive that mirrored her own in ways that made their initial connection feel like the meeting of equals. Michael Farrar was handsome, capable, and by all accounts genuinely impressive in the ways that matter in academic and professional environments. And the relationship that developed between him and Debora had the quality of a partnership between 2 people who recognized in each other a comparable level of ability and aspiration. They married, and the early years of the marriage were characterized by a particular kind of mutual striving that defines the lives of 2 high-achieving professionals building careers simultaneously, demanding, exhausting, and sustained by the shared conviction that the sacrifice and effort of those early years would eventually yield the life they were working toward. They settled in the Kansas City area, where both built their medical practices, and the family grew with the births of their 3 children. Timothy, called Tim, born in the early years of the marriage, Kate and Kelly. The house they ultimately occupied in Prairie Village, a wealthy suburb of Kansas City in Johnson County, Kansas, was large and well-appointed, befitting the combined professional success of 2 physicians at the height of their careers, and from the outside the Farrar Green family appeared to represent a particular version of the American professional dream: wealth, achievement, beautiful children, a place in the upper stratum of their community. What was happening beneath that surface, however, was a marriage in an advanced state of deterioration that neither Debora nor Michael had found a way to address, repair, or cleanly end. The relationship had been troubled for years, strained by the particular pressures that attend 2 physician households, the competing demands of 2 demanding careers, the exhaustion of maintaining a large family while sustaining professional identities, the way in which high-achieving people can grow alongside each other professionally while growing apart from each other personally in ways that are gradual and insidious and difficult to identify until the distance has become unbridgeable. Michael Farrar had developed feelings for another woman, a colleague named Celeste Walker, and while the precise timeline and nature of his relationship with Walker was a matter of dispute and legal significance, it is clear that by the mid-1990s Michael was emotionally and in some respects physically disengaged from the marriage in ways that Debora was acutely and agonizingly aware of. For Debora, Michael's detachment was not merely the ordinary grief of marriage failing. It was an assault on her identity at its most fundamental level, because the marriage and a family and the life they had built together were not simply things she valued, but things that defined her, and the prospect of losing them was experienced as an existential threat of the first order. She began drinking heavily, a development that those around her noted with concern, and that reflected the degree to which her psychological resources for coping with the disintegration of her marriage were being overwhelmed by the scale of what she was facing. The drinking impaired her professional functioning, damaged her relationships with her children and colleagues, and contributed to a progressive deterioration of the careful, controlled, high-functioning persona she had maintained throughout her adult life. It was against this backdrop of marital collapse, professional deterioration, and psychological unraveling that the events of 1995 began to unfold. Events so extreme and so deliberately destructive that they would later be understood not simply as the acts of a desperate woman, but as the expression of a pathological psychology that found in the destruction of the people around her the only available response to the destruction she felt within herself. The first indication that something had moved beyond the realm of ordinary marital dysfunction into something far more dangerous came in the spring and summer of 1995, when Michael Farrar began experiencing episodes of severe and unexplained illness. The symptoms, nausea, vomiting, gastrointestinal distress of an extreme and debilitating kind, came on suddenly and with intensity that sent him to the emergency room on multiple occasions. And the pattern of the episodes was puzzling to the physicians who examined him because the symptoms did not conform to presentation of any obvious illness, and because they tended to occur after Michael had eaten or drunk something at home. Michael himself began to suspect, as the episodes continued and as he observed the pattern of their occurrence, that he was being poisoned, a suspicion that was not merely the paranoia of an ill man, but a medically informed inference drawn from the specific nature of his symptoms and the circumstances under which they arose. He confided a suspicion to others, including eventually law enforcement, and the investigation that followed would confirm what he feared. Toxicological testing conducted during the investigation of Michael's illness detected the presence of ricin in samples associated with the case, a finding that was both extraordinary and deeply alarming. Ricin is one of the most toxic naturally occurring substances known to science, derived from the castor bean plant, and its presence in the context of Michael Farrar's recurring illness pointed directly to deliberate poisoning by someone with access to both the substance and the opportunity to administer it. Debora Green, as a physician with scientific training, and as a person with the most consistent access to the food and drink Michael consumed at home, became the primary focus of the investigation. Though establishing the full scope and mechanism of the poisoning presented significant forensic challenges given the complexity of ricin detection and the difficulties of establishing a clear chain of evidence connecting the substance to Debora's administration of it. The ricin poisoning investigation was still developing when the case took a turn that elevated it from a poisoning investigation to something immeasurably more devastating. On the night of October 23, 1995, a fire broke out at the Farrar Green family home at 7517 Canterbury Court in Prairie Village, Kansas. The fire started in the early morning hours when the household was asleep, and it spread with a speed and intensity that engulfed significant portions of the large house before firefighters could bring it under control. Michael Farrar and his daughter Kate escaped the burning house. Tim and Kelly, however, did not. Timothy Farrar, who was 13 years old, and Kelly Farrar, who was 10 years old, died in the fire. Their deaths were among the most agonizing facts of a case already saturated with tragedy, and the image of two children dying in a fire in their own home while their parents survived became one of the defining emotional realities of a case that would generate extensive media coverage and public outrage in the months that followed. Kate, who survived the fire, sustained injuries in her escape. Michael Farrar, already weakened by months of ricin poisoning, survived as well. The fire investigation, conducted by the Prairie Village Fire Department and the Kansas State Fire Marshal's Office, determined that the fire had been deliberately set, that it was arson, not an accident. The origin and cause investigation identified multiple points of ignition within the house consistent with the deliberate use of an accelerant, a finding that pointed unmistakably towards someone inside the home having started the fire intentionally. The combination of the ricin poisoning investigation and the arson finding focused investigative attention on Debora Green with an intensity that left little doubt among the investigators working the case about where the evidence was pointing. The challenge was building a prosecutable case that met the evidentiary standards required for conviction on charges as serious as murder and attempted murder. The investigation was led by the Prairie Village Police Department in conjunction with the Johnson County District Attorney's Office, and the lead prosecutor was Paul Morrison, a formidably experienced and well-regarded Kansas prosecutor who would later serve as Johnson County District Attorney, and who approached the Debora Green case with the methodical thoroughness that its complexity demanded. Morrison and his investigative team built a case that drew on the toxicological evidence from the ricin poisoning investigation, the arson findings from the fire investigation, financial records, and other documentary evidence. The testimony of witnesses who had observed Debora's behavior and state of mind in the period leading up to the events, and the account of Michael Farrar himself about the poisoning episodes and the state of the marriage. The case was reinforced by the work of Rowlett, the true crime author who had previously written about Diane Downs and who became interested in the Debora Green case, eventually producing the book Bitter Harvest, published in 1997, which provided an exhaustive account of the investigation and the legal proceedings, and which became one of the definitive records of the case. Debora Green was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Tim and Kelly in the fire, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder for the attempt on Michael Farrar's life through the ricin poisoning, and 1 count of aggravated arson. She was taken into custody, and the case proceeded toward trial in 1996. However, before the case went to a jury, Debora Green made a decision to enter into a plea agreement with the prosecution, a decision that surprised many observers given the gravity of the charges and the potential for a death penalty prosecution, but one that reflected the calculated assessment of her defense team and, perhaps, Debora's own recognition of the weight of the evidence against her. Under the terms of the plea agreement negotiated with Paul Morrison's office, Debora Green pleaded no contest to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted first-degree murder. A no-contest plea, under Kansas law, carries the same legal consequences as a guilty plea for purposes of sentencing, but does not require the defendant to formally admit guilt, a distinction that is primarily psychological rather than legal, but that was apparently meaningful to Debora in the context of how she understood and characterized her own actions. Judge Peter Ruddick presided over the sentencing hearing, which took place in January 1996, and the proceeding was one of the most emotionally charged moments of a case that had been emotionally charged throughout. Michael Farrar addressed the court, describing the loss of his children and the impact of Debora's actions on every dimension of his life, and the life of his surviving daughter, Kate, with gravity and pain that those present described as devastating to witness. Kate Farrar, who had survived the fire and who was living with Michael in the aftermath of her siblings' deaths, was also a presence whose reality gave the abstract legal proceedings a human weight that was impossible to ignore. Debora Green addressed the court as well, and her statement was scrutinized with the same intensity that every aspect of her behavior had been scrutinized throughout the case, for signs of genuine remorse, for evidence of the psychological state that had produced the events of 1995, for any indication that the woman who had poisoned her husband and set fire to her house with her children inside had achieved any meaningful understanding of what she had done and why. The statement she gave was not universally regarded as convincingly remorseful, and the question of whether Debora Green truly understood the magnitude of her actions or whether her self-understanding remained filtered through the distorting lens of psychology that had produced those actions was one that observers and analysts continued to debate long after the sentencing was concluded. Judge Ruddick sentenced Debora Green to 2 consecutive terms of 40 years in prison, 1 for each count of first-degree murder, plus a concurrent term for the attempted murder of Michael Farrar, resulting in an aggregate sentence of 80 years with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The sentence was intended to ensure that Debora would spend the remainder of her productive life in prison, and those who had followed the case closely largely regarded the outcome as an appropriate response to crimes of extraordinary severity. even as some observers noted that the plea agreement had avoided the full public airing of evidence and testimony that a trial would have provided, and that the victims' families and the broader public might have found valuable in their efforts to understand what had happened and why. Debora Green began serving her sentence at the Topeka Correctional Facility in Kansas, where she has remained incarcerated. She has become eligible for parole review under the terms of her sentence, and the question of whether she will ever be released has been a periodic subject of public discussion in Kansas, with victim advocates and members of the public consistently arguing that the nature of her crimes, the deliberate and premeditated attempt to kill her husband through one of the most exotic and lethal poisons available, an intentional setting of a fire that killed 2 of her own children, places her beyond the appropriate reach of parole consideration. Michael Farrar rebuilt his life in the years following conviction, remarrying and continuing his medical career with a resilience that those who knew him regarded as remarkable given the magnitude of what he had endured. Not only the loss of 2 children and the near loss of his own life through poisoning, but the particular psychological complexity of having those losses inflicted by the woman he had been married to for years, the mother of his children, a physician like himself whose professional identity was built on the premise of healing rather than harm. Kate Farrar, who survived the fire, grew up in Michael's care and has navigated the aftermath of her childhood in ways that have been largely private, her life representing, like that of Christy Downs in the Diane Downs case, the particular and extraordinary challenge of building a future in the shadow of a past defined by violence and loss at the hands of a parent. Timothy Farrar, who was 13 years old, and Kelly Farrar, who was 10, are buried in the Kansas City area. Their lives ended by a fire their mother set in the house where they slept, a fire that was itself only the final and most catastrophic expression of psychology that had been moving toward destruction for years before it found its ultimate and irreversible form on the night of October 23, 1995. The case of Debora Green remains one of the most extraordinary and disturbing examples in American criminal history of the capacity for destruction that can exist within a person of exceptional intelligence and professional achievement, and of the particular horror that results when the knowledge and capability that medicine confers are turned not toward healing, but toward the deliberate and calculated elimination of the people who stand between the disintegrating self and the annihilation it is. Seeking. Number 7. Marilyn Lemak, the Illinois mother who drugged and suffocated her 3 children in their beds, then attempted to take her own life, in an act she described as an effort to spare them from the pain of their parents' divorce. Marilyn Lemak was born Marilyn Lemak on April 14, 1960, in the Chicago metropolitan area of Illinois, and she grew up in the kind of suburban environment that defines so much of the social geography of the greater Chicago region, a world of tidy neighborhoods, organized community life, good schools, and the particular set of aspirations and expectations that middle-class suburban culture generates in the children raised within it. From an early age, Marilyn was a conscientious, organized, and achievement-oriented young woman whose approach to the world was characterized by the careful management of appearances and the diligent pursuit of the markers of success that her environment had taught her to value. She was not an outwardly flamboyant or dramatically attention-seeking personality in the way of some of the other women whose cases appear in this series. She did not have the grandiosity of Diane Downs or the social confidence of Darlie Routier, but she had a deep and genuine investment in the image of herself as a competent, capable, successful person, and she built her adult life with the methodical intentionality of someone for whom control and order were not merely preferences but psychological necessities. She went on to pursue a career in nursing, a profession that suited her organizational temperament and her desire to be seen as competent and caring, and she worked as a nurse in the Chicago area for a number of years, developing a professional identity that she valued deeply and that gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that was central to how she understood herself. It was through the social networks of her professional and personal life in the Chicago suburbs that Marilyn met David Lemak, a physician whose professional standing, intelligence, and personal qualities represented to Marilyn the kind of partner around whom she could construct the life she envisioned for herself. David was a successful doctor, and the marriage between a physician and a nurse had a particular social legibility in their community, a pairing that made sense on its surface, and that promised a life of professional accomplishment, material comfort, and social standing. They married, and Marilyn made the decision to leave her nursing career to become a full-time homemaker and mother, a choice that was both a reflection of the values of their community and a practical response to the demands of raising children while managing the household of a busy physician. The decision to leave nursing was one that Marilyn later described as having been more consequential to her psychological well-being than she had anticipated at the time. The loss of professional identity she had worked to build, and the complete transfer of her sense of purpose and worth to the domain of wife and mother left her more dependent than she had been before on the stability of her marriage and her family as the primary sources of her self-definition. When that stability began to erode, the erosion was experienced not merely as the ordinary pain of a difficult marriage, but as a fundamental threat to everything that gave her life meaning and coherence. The couple settled in Naperville, Illinois, one of the largest and most affluent suburbs in the greater Chicago area, a community known for its excellent schools, its high property values, and its reputation as one of the most desirable places in Illinois to raise a family. They had 3 children together: Thomas, who was 7 years old at the time of the events of March 1999, Nicholas, who was 6, and Emily, who was 3. The Lemak household on the surface was exactly what its suburban setting suggested: a large, comfortable home, a successful professional husband, a devoted full-time mother, 3 healthy and by all accounts delightful children who were engaged in the activities and relationships of their respective ages, with the ordinary enthusiasm of children in loving, stable homes. Thomas and Nicholas were in school, involved in sports and friendships and the social world of childhood. Emily was a toddler, the youngest and in some ways the most vulnerable member of a family that was beneath the surface of its comfortable appearance, moving toward crisis with momentum that Marilyn could feel, but could not stop and could not, ultimately, survive in a way that the children deserved. The marriage between Marilyn and David Lemak had been deteriorating for a period of years before March 1999, worn down by the accumulating friction of 2 people whose needs and trajectories had diverged in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore or paper over. David had developed a romantic relationship with another woman, a fact that Marilyn became aware of and that represented for her not merely the ordinary devastation of spousal infidelity, but a confirmation of her deepest fears about her own worth and her own future. The prospect of divorce was something Marilyn found psychologically catastrophic in a way that went beyond the practical and legal dimensions of process. It was experienced as an annihilation of the identity she had constructed over the years of her marriage, the loss of the role of wife and homemaker and the partner of a successful physician that had become the entire architecture of her self-understanding after she left nursing. She was also deeply and genuinely terrified about what divorce would mean for her children and her relationship with them, and the fear that she would lose meaningful access to Thomas, Nicholas, and Emily in the context of a contested custody process was one that she expressed to those around her in the months leading up to March 1999 with an intensity that reflected the degree to which her children had become not merely the people she loved most in the world, but the last remaining anchor of an identity that was otherwise dissolving. David had indicated that he intended to pursue divorce, and the legal process was apparently in its early stages when the events of March 4th, 1999, occurred, though the precise state of the divorce proceedings and what Marilyn had been told about the likely custody arrangements has been a matter of some legal and analytical significance in the years since the case came to public attention. In the days leading up to March 4th, 1999, Marilyn Lemak made preparations that investigators and prosecutors later characterized as evidence of premeditation and deliberate planning. She obtained a quantity of the sedative medication Benadryl, diphenhydramine, in a form and quantity sufficient to sedate 3 children, and she obtained or had access to materials she would use in the process of killing them. The precise sequence of her planning, including when she made the decision to kill her children and how she moved from whatever psychological state preceded that decision to the act of carrying it out, has been examined in considerable detail in the legal proceedings and the psychological evaluations that accompanied them. And the picture that emerges is of a woman who had been moving toward a breaking point for months and who, in the days before March 4th, crossed a threshold from which she did not turn back. On the evening of March 4th, 1999, Marilyn Lemak administered Benadryl to her 3 children, mixing it into their food or drink in quantity sufficient to make them drowsy and compliant. As the children became sedated, she suffocated each of them. Thomas, who was 7 years old, was killed in his bed. Nicholas, who was 6, was killed in his bed. Emily, who was 3 years old, was killed in her bed. After killing her children, Marilyn Lemak attempted to take her own life by taking an overdose of medication and cutting her wrists, an attempt that was serious enough that she was in a medically compromised state when she was discovered the following day, but not serious enough to kill her. She was found alive in a house on the morning of March 5, 1999, when David Lemak, unable to reach Marilyn or the children by telephone, went to the house and discovered what had happened. The discovery of the 3 children in their beds and the presence of their mother in a state of medical distress from her suicide attempt was a scene of horror that the first responding officers and emergency medical personnel who arrived at the Naperville house that morning described as among the most devastating they had ever encountered in their professional lives. The children appeared peaceful in their beds in a way that suffocation victims sometimes do when the act has been carried out carefully and without struggle, a quality of apparent peacefulness that was in some respects more disturbing than obvious signs of violence would have been, because it underscored the premeditation and the intimacy of what had been done. Thomas, Nicholas, and Emily Lemak had been put to bed by their mother, sedated by their mother, and killed by their mother in a process that bore the terrible hallmarks of deliberate and careful planning rather than explosive violence. Marilyn was transported to a hospital where she received treatment for her injuries and the medication overdose, and she was placed in police custody as her condition stabilized. The investigation was conducted by the Naperville Police Department in conjunction with the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office, and from the earliest stages of the investigation, the direction of the evidence was unambiguous. There was no question about what had happened or who had done it, only questions about the psychological state of the woman who had done it and what that state meant for the legal proceedings that would follow. The case of Marilyn Lemak entered the public consciousness of the greater Chicago area and eventually the nation through the extensive coverage it received in the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Chicago television news market, and the emotional response it generated was one of the most visceral that a crime case had produced in the region in years. The killing of 3 children by their mother in a quiet, affluent Naperville neighborhood struck at something fundamental in the community's sense of safety and normalcy. These were not children from troubled circumstances, not children whose vulnerability had been visible in advance, not children who had been failed by social systems designed to protect them. They were children in a large, comfortable house in one of the safest communities in Illinois, and the person who had killed them was the person most absolutely charged with their protection. The community's response was one of grief, shock, and a quality of existential disturbance that the ordinariness of the Lemak family's external circumstances made particularly difficult to process or contain. Marilyn Lemak was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. From the beginning of the legal proceedings, the central question was not whether Marilyn had killed her children. That was not in dispute, but whether she was legally sane at the time of the killings, whether the nature and degree of her mental illness at the time of the offense met the legal standard for an insanity defense under Illinois law, and what the appropriate legal and moral response to her actions should be given the complexity of her psychological state. The insanity defense in Illinois, as in most American jurisdictions, requires that the defendant demonstrate that as a result of mental disease or defect she lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law, a standard that is demanding and that is met in only a small fraction of the cases in which it is raised. Marilyn's defense team engaged forensic psychiatrists and psychologists who examined her extensively and who developed a picture of a woman who had been in the grip of a severe major depressive disorder with psychotic features in the period leading up to and during the killings. A woman whose psychological state had deteriorated to a point at which her capacity to appreciate the full criminality of what she was doing was genuinely and substantially impaired. The psychiatric testimony presented on Marilyn's behalf described a clinical picture of a major depressive episode of extreme severity, accompanied by delusional thinking that centered on her children's futures in a way that bore some structural resemblance to the delusional system that had characterized Andrea Yates' psychology, a fixed and irrational conviction that the children would suffer unbearably in the aftermath of the divorce, that they would be damaged in ways they could not survive, and that killing them was an act of protection and love rather than violence and destruction. The defense argued that this delusional framework had so thoroughly distorted Marilyn's perception of reality that she had been genuinely incapable of appreciating the criminality of her actions in a legally relevant sense, that the woman who sedated and suffocated her children believed in her psychotically distorted understanding that she was sparing them from suffering rather than inflicting it. The prosecution challenged this framework, arguing that the evidence of planning and premeditation, the procurement of the sedative medication, the careful and sequential execution of the killings, the subsequent suicide attempt, was inconsistent with the level of psychological incapacity required for a successful insanity defense, and that Marilyn had known what she was doing and had known that it was wrong in the legally relevant sense, even if her reasons for doing it were shaped by severe depression and distorted thinking. The trial took place in DuPage County before Judge Ronald Melling, and it proceeded through extensive psychiatric testimony, the presentation of physical evidence about the manner of the children's deaths, and the account of witnesses who had known Marilyn in the period leading up to the killings and who testified about the deterioration they had observed in her psychological state. David Lemak testified, and his testimony was a study in particular anguish of a man who had lost his 3 children to the actions of his estranged wife, grief, guilt, anger, and the crushing complexity of emotions that accompany a loss so total and so intimate. The jury heard all of this testimony and deliberated on the question of Marilyn's sanity with the seriousness that the gravity of the case demanded. On March 7, 2001, after deliberating for approximately 2 days, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, rejecting the insanity defense. The verdict meant that Marilyn Lemak would be sentenced as a legally sane person who had committed 3 premeditated murders, and the sentencing that followed was a final formal act of legal process that had lasted 2 years and that had given the community of Naperville and the broader public a detailed and devastating account of what had happened in that house on the night of March 4th, 1999. Judge Melling sentenced Marilyn Lemak to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole, the most severe sentence available under Illinois law in a case in which the death penalty had not been sought. The sentence meant that Marilyn Lemak would spend the remainder of her life in the Illinois Department of Corrections, never to be released, a determination that Judge Melling arrived at after considering the nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the impact of the losses on David Lemak, on the extended family, and on the broader community. The sentence was received by the community and by observers of the case as appropriate in its gravity, even among those who believed that Marilyn had been genuinely mentally ill at the time of the killings, because the magnitude of what she had done, the deliberate, premeditated ending of 3 young lives, placed the case beyond the reach of any response that did not involve permanent incapacitation. Marilyn Lemak was transported to the Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois, where she has remained incarcerated since her conviction. In the years since her incarceration, Marilyn Lemak has been the subject of occasional media interest and public discussion, primarily in the context of broader conversations about the relationship between severe depression, suicidal ideation, and filicide, the particular category of parental child killing that criminologists distinguish from other forms of murder by the nature of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim and by the psychological frameworks that tend to accompany it. Researchers who study filicide have noted that cases in which a depressed parent kills children as part of a suicide plan or an altruistic delusion, the belief that the children will be better off dead than left to face a difficult future, represent a distinct subcategory of parental violence that requires clinical and legal frameworks capable of capturing the particular nature of the perpetrator's psychology. The case of Marilyn Lemak is cited in this literature alongside the case of Andrea Yates as an example of the way in which severe depression with psychotic features can produce a belief system so distorted that a parent genuinely believes that killing her children is an act of love, a distortion so complete and so catastrophic in its consequences that it challenges the ordinary moral and legal categories through which we understand violence and culpability. David Lemak rebuilt his life in the years following the conviction, and those who know him have described the process of recovery as long and nonlinear, marked by the particular challenge of grieving 3 children, while also processing the knowledge that they were killed by their mother, a woman he had once loved, and with whom he had built a family whose destruction defined the worst moment of his life. Thomas Lemak, who was 7 years old, Nicholas Lemak, who was 6 years old, and Emily Lemak, who was 3 years old, are buried in the Chicago area. Their lives ended on a March night in 1999 in a house where they had always felt safe, by the hands of the woman who had brought them into the world and whose love for them, however catastrophically expressed and however thoroughly distorted by illness and desperation and the collapse of her own psychological world, was in some terrible and irreducible sense real. The case of Marilyn Lemak is a study in the most painful kind of tragedy, Not the tragedy of evil without love, but the tragedy of love so disordered by illness and desperation that it became indistinguishable from its opposite, and 3 children paid with their lives for a distinction their mother had lost the capacity to make. Number 8. Lashanda Armstrong, the New York mother who drove a minivan carrying her 4 children into the Hudson River, killing herself and 3 of them, while her 10-year-old son escaped through a window and swam to shore to tell the world what had happened. Lashanda Armstrong was born on October 31st, 1981, in the Hudson Valley region of New York State, and she grew up in circumstances shaped by a particular combination of economic fragility, family instability, and limited social support that characterizes the lives of many young people raised in the smaller cities and post-industrial communities of upstate New York, places that occupy a complicated position in the American social landscape. Neither the concentrated poverty of the largest urban centers nor the relative stability of affluent suburbs, but rather a middle ground defined by persistent economic stress, diminished opportunity, and a kind of chronic low-level precariousness that makes every crisis harder to absorb and every setback harder to recover from. The details of Lashanda's early life are less extensively documented in the public record than those of some of the other women in this series, in part because she was not a public figure before the events of April 12, 2011, and in part because the investigation that followed her death was a matter of reconstructing events rather than building a prosecution. But the picture that emerged from accounts given by family members, friends, neighbors, and the investigators who examined her life in the aftermath of the tragedy was one of a young woman who had been navigating genuinely difficult circumstances for most of her adult life, with a resilience that was real, but that had been stretched by the time of her death to its absolute limit. Lashanda had 4 children, whose ages at the time of the events of April 12, 2011, ranged from 10 years old to just 11 weeks old. Her eldest child was Lashanda Armstrong, who was 10 years old, a boy who would, in the most harrowing circumstances imaginable, become the central witness to what happened that night, and the only member of his immediate family to survive it. Her second child was Landon Armstrong, who was 5 years old. Her third child was Lance Armstrong, who was 2 years old. Her youngest child was Leah Armstrong, who was just 11 weeks old at the time of her death, an infant so new to the world that the fact of her existence had barely registered in the social record before she was gone from it. The father of the children, or at least a dominant figure in Lashanda's domestic life in the period leading up to the events of April 2011, was a man named John Pierre, and the relationship between Lashanda and John Pierre was by all accounts from those who knew them a deeply troubled one, characterized by conflict, volatility, and the kind of emotional toxicity that accumulates over years of a relationship in which both parties are bringing significant pain and dysfunction to an already fragile domestic situation. Jean-Pierre had other children by other women, a fact that was a persistent source of conflict in his relationship with Lashanda and the dynamics of the household they shared in Newburgh, New York, a small city on the west bank of the Hudson River in Orange County, were described by those familiar with the family as tense, volatile, and frequently destabilizing for everyone within it. Newburgh is a city with a history that mirrors in many respects the broader trajectory of post-industrial America, a place that was once economically vital and that declined significantly in the latter half of the 20th century as the industries that had sustained it contracted or disappeared, leaving behind elevated poverty rates, persistent unemployment, and the social consequences that tend to follow economic deterioration over generations. Lashanda and John Pierre lived in Newburgh with the 4 children in circumstances that were by any measure difficult. Financial stress, a troubled relationship, the demands of caring for 4 young children, including a newborn, and the absence of a kind of robust support network that might have helped absorb the pressures bearing down on the household. Those who knew Lashanda in the months leading up to April 2011 described a woman who was visibly struggling, who had expressed distress about her relationship with John Pierre and about her circumstances more generally, and who was showing signs of psychological deterioration that, in retrospect, the people around her recognized as warning signals they had not known how to respond to in the moment. She had reportedly discovered or been confronted with evidence of Jean Pierre's continued contact with other women, and the impact of that discovery on a woman already managing the stresses of new motherhood, financial precariousness, and a volatile relationship was, by the accounts of those who knew her, severe and destabilizing in ways that went beyond the ordinary grief of relationship conflict. In the days immediately preceding April 12, 2011, those close to Lashanda noted that she seemed particularly distressed, and there were communications, text messages and conversations, that suggested she was in a state of acute psychological crisis. The specific content and context of those communications became part of the investigative record compiled by the New York State Police and the Orange County authorities in the aftermath of the events, and they painted a picture of a woman in the final stages of a psychological collapse that had been building for weeks or months and that had not been intercepted by any of the systems, medical, social, familial, that might theoretically have been positioned to help. On the evening of April 12, 2011, Lashanda Armstrong drove her minivan, a 2003 Dodge Grand Caravan, from a family's residence in Newburgh toward the Hudson River. The 4 children were in the vehicle with her. LaShawn, her 10-year-old son, was in the front passenger seat. Landon, who was 5, Lance, who was 2, and infant Leah were in the rear of the vehicle. The drive took them through Newburgh toward the boat launch area at the foot of North Street, a location at the edge of the Hudson River, where the land meets the water with the abruptness of a concrete boundary at the end of a road. What happened at the boat launch on the night of April 12, 2011, is known in its essential outlines from the account of the one person who survived to tell it, Lashanda Armstrong, 10 years old, who had demonstrated in the most extreme circumstances a survival instinct and a physical courage that those who heard his account found almost impossible to comprehend. Lashanda drove the minivan down the boat launch ramp and into the Hudson River. The vehicle entered the water and began to sink. In the moments as the vehicle filled with water, the minivan was located submerged in the Hudson River at the foot of the boat launch. Divers entered the water and recovered the vehicle and its occupants. Lashanda Armstrong was found dead inside the minivan. Landon Armstrong, who was 5 years old, was found dead. Lance Armstrong, who was 2 years old, was found dead. Leah Armstrong, who was 11 weeks old, was found dead. The recovery of the 4 bodies from the submerged vehicle, a mother and 3 of her children, the youngest barely 2 months old, was described by the first responders who participated in it as one of the most devastating experiences of their professional lives, and the images of the recovery operation, which was conducted in the glare of emergency lighting reflected on the dark surface of the Hudson River, were broadcast by news organizations across the country and around the world in the days that followed, generating an outpouring of grief and shock that reflected the particular horror of a tragedy in which the most vulnerable possible victims, children, including a newborn, had been killed by the person charged with their protection. The investigation that followed was conducted by the New York State Police, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and the Newburgh City Police Department, and it proceeded not toward the prosecution of a suspect, Lashanda was dead, but toward the reconstruction of events and the documentation of circumstances sufficient to support a formal legal and medical determination about what had happened and why. The investigation included a review of Lashanda's communications in the days and hours preceding April 12, 2011, interviews with family members, friends, and Jean-Pierre, a forensic examination of the vehicle and the scene, and the medical examiner's analysis of the death of Lashanda and the 3 children. The Orange County Medical Examiner determined that the cause of death for Lashanda and the 3 children was drowning, and the manner of death of the children was ruled homicide, a determination that reflected the legal and medical reality that the children had been killed by the deliberate act of another person regardless of that person's state of mind or survival status. Lashanda's own death was ruled a suicide. Jean-Pierre gave statements to investigators and was interviewed extensively about the state of the relationship and the events leading up to April 12, 2011. He acknowledged the conflicts that had characterized the relationship and the distress that Lashanda had been expressing in the days preceding her death, and his account of the dynamics of their household confirmed in broad terms what other witnesses had described: a relationship under severe stress, a woman in psychological crisis, and a domestic situation that had been generating warning signs that had not been adequately recognized or responded to. The question of whether Jean-Pierre bore any moral or legal responsibility for the circumstances that led to Lashanda's actions was a subject of considerable public discussion in the aftermath of the tragedy. with some commentators and advocates arguing that the dynamics of the relationship and the specific triggers of the crisis pointed toward a form of accountability that the criminal justice system, which was not structured to assign responsibility to someone whose partner killed herself and their children, was ill-equipped to address. No criminal charges were filed against Jean-Pierre in connection with the deaths. The case of Lashanda Armstrong generated significant media coverage and public discussion in the spring of 2011, and it was situated by commentators and advocates within a broader conversation about domestic violence, intimate partner conflict, and the relationship between relationship dysfunction and maternal filicide that researchers in the field of child maltreatment and family violence have been developing for years. The specific circumstances of the Armstrong case, a young mother in an unstable relationship, under severe economic and emotional stress, with a newborn and 3 young children, in a community with limited mental health resources, showing signs of acute psychological crisis in the days before she acted, represented a confluence of risk factors that researchers who study filicide have identified as characteristic of a particular type of maternal child killing, one in which the mother's own suicidality and the killing of the children are part of a single psychological act rather than separate events, driven by a psychology that has arrived at the conclusion that death is the only available resolution to an unbearable situation, and that extends that conclusion, with a terrible and irrational logic, to the children as well. Lashanda Armstrong, the 10-year-old boy who escaped the window of the sinking minivan, was placed in the care of family members following the tragedy, and has grown up in the years since in circumstances that those close to him have described with a combination of admiration for his resilience and acknowledgement of the profound and enduring impact of what he witnessed and survived on April 12, 2011. The psychological burden carried by a child who survived an event of that nature, who watched his mother drive into a river, who lost 3 siblings in the space of minutes, who swam to shore in the dark and told strangers what had happened, is not the kind of burden that resolves over time in a way that ordinary childhood difficulties do, and those who have advocated for Lashanda in the years since the tragedy have emphasized the importance of sustained, specialized psychological support for a young person navigating a grief and a trauma as singular and as devastating as his. His survival, which was a product of his own extraordinary response in an impossible moment, is at once the most redemptive and the most heartbreaking element of a story that has very little redemption in it. The one life saved in the midst of her lost, the witness whose survival made it possible for the world to know what happened on the Hudson River that night, but whose witness came at a cost that no child should ever be asked to pay. The community of Newburgh mourned the deaths of Landon, Lance, and Leah Armstrong with particular grief that a community expresses when children are lost. The flowers left at memorials, the vigils held in the nights that followed, the expressions of sorrow and disbelief from neighbors and community members who had known the family, or who simply felt the weight of the loss as any human being feels the weight of the death of children. The case prompted renewed calls from advocates and mental health professionals for improved access to mental health services in economically distressed communities, for better identification and intervention protocols for women showing signs of acute psychological crisis in the context of volatile domestic relationships, and for a more sophisticated public and institutional understanding of the relationship between intimate partner conflict, maternal mental health, and child safety. Calls that were genuine and well-founded, but that, as is so often the case in the aftermath of tragedies of this kind, generated more discussion than durable systemic change. Lashanda Armstrong was 29 years old when she died in the Hudson River on April 12, 2011. Landon Armstrong was 5. Lance Armstrong was 2. Leah Armstrong was 11 weeks old. Their deaths and the survival of Lashanda Armstrong are the permanent human record of a night when the river took a family and one boy swam back. The minivan was located submerged in the Hudson River at the foot of the boat launch. Divers entered the water and recovered the vehicle and its occupants. Lashanda Armstrong was found dead inside the minivan. Landon Armstrong, who was 5 years old, was found dead. Lance Armstrong, who was 2 years old, was found dead. Leah Armstrong, who was 11 weeks old, was found dead. The recovery of the 4 bodies from the submerged vehicle, a mother and 3 of her children, the youngest barely 2 months old, was described by the first responders who participated in it as one of the most devastating experiences of their professional lives, and the images of the recovery operation which was conducted in the glare of emergency lighting reflected on the dark surface of the Hudson River, were broadcast by news organizations across the country and around the world in the days that followed, generating an outpouring of grief and shock that reflected the particular horror of a tragedy in which the most vulnerable possible victims, children, including a newborn, had been killed by the person charged with their protection. The investigation that followed was conducted by the New York State Police, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and the Newburgh City Police Department, and it proceeded not toward the prosecution of a suspect. Lashanda was dead, but toward the reconstruction of events and the documentation of circumstances sufficient to support a formal legal and medical determination about what had happened and why. The investigation included a review of Lashanda's communications in the days and hours preceding April 12, 2011, interviews with family members, friends, and Jean-Pierre, a forensic examination of the vehicle and the scene, and the medical examiner's analysis of the deaths of Lashanda and the 3 children. The Orange County Medical Examiner determined that the cause of death for Lashanda and the 3 children was drowning, and the manner of death of the children was rule homicide, a determination that reflected the legal and medical reality that the children had been killed by the deliberate act of another person regardless of that person's state of mind or survival status. Lashanda's own death was ruled a suicide. Jean-Pierre gave statements to investigators and was interviewed extensively about the state of the relationship and the events leading up to April 12, 2011. He acknowledged the conflicts that had characterized the relationship and the distress that Lashanda had been expressing in the days preceding her death, and his account of the dynamics of their household confirmed in broad terms what other witnesses had described: a relationship under severe stress, a woman in psychological crisis, and a domestic situation that had been generating warning signs that had not been adequately recognized or responded to. The question of whether Jean-Pierre bore any moral or legal responsibility for the circumstances that led to Lashanda's actions was a subject of considerable public discussion in the aftermath of the tragedy, with some commentators and advocates arguing that the dynamics of the relationship and the specific triggers of the crisis pointed toward a form of accountability that the criminal justice system, which was not structured to assign responsibility to someone whose partner killed herself and their children, was ill-equipped to address. No criminal charges were filed against Jean-Pierre in connection with the deaths. The case of Lashanda Armstrong generated significant media coverage and public discussion in the spring of 2011, and it was situated by commentators and advocates within a broader conversation about domestic violence, intimate partner conflict, and the relationship between relationship dysfunction and maternal filicide that researchers in the field of child maltreatment and family violence have been developing for years. The specific circumstances of the Armstrong case, a young mother in an unstable relationship, under severe economic and emotional stress, with a newborn and 3 young children, in a community with limited mental health resources, showing signs of acute psychological crisis in the days before she acted, represented a confluence of risk factors that researchers who study filicide have identified as characteristic of a particular type of maternal child killing, one in which the mother's own suicidality and the killing of the children are part of a single psychological act rather than separate events, driven by a psychology that has arrived at the conclusion that death is the only available resolution to an unbearable situation, and that extends that conclusion, with a terrible and irrational logic, to the children as well. Lashanda Armstrong, the 10-year-old boy who escaped the window of the sinking minivan, was placed in the care of family members following the tragedy, and has grown up in the years since in circumstances that those close to him have described with a combination of admiration for his resilience and acknowledgement of the profound and enduring impact of what he witnessed and survived on April 12, 2011. The psychological burden carried by a child who survived an event of that nature, who watched his mother drive into a river, who lost 3 siblings in the space of minutes, who swam to shore in the dark, and told strangers what had happened, is not the kind of burden that resolves over time in a way that ordinary childhood difficulties do, and those who have advocated for Lashanda in the years since the tragedy have emphasized the importance of sustained, specialized psychological support for a young person navigating a grief and a trauma as singular and as devastating as his. His survival, which was a product of his own extraordinary response in an impossible moment, is at once the most redemptive and the most heartbreaking element of a story that has very little redemption in it, the one life saved in the midst of her lost. the witness whose survival made it possible for the world to know what happened on the Hudson River that night, but whose witness came at a cost that no child should ever be asked to pay. The community of Newburgh mourned the deaths of Landon, Lance, and Leah Armstrong with particular grief that a community expresses when children are lost. The flowers left at memorials, the vigils held in the nights that followed, the expressions of sorrow and disbelief from neighbors and community members who had known the family, or who simply felt the weight of the loss as any human being feels the weight of the death of children. The case prompted renewed calls from advocates and mental health professionals for improved access to mental health services in economically distressed communities, for better identification and intervention protocols for women showing signs of acute psychological crisis in the context of volatile domestic relationships, and for a more sophisticated public and institutional understanding of the relationship between intimate partner conflict, maternal mental health, and child safety. Calls that were genuine and well-founded, but that, as is so often the case in the aftermath of tragedies of this kind, generated more discussion than durable systemic change. Lashanda Armstrong was 29 years old when she died in the Hudson River on April 12, 2011. Landon Armstrong was 5. Lance Armstrong was 2. Leah Armstrong was 11 weeks old. Their deaths and the survival of LaShawn Armstrong are the permanent human record of a night when the river took a family and one boy swam back. Number 9, Tonya Thomas, the Florida mother who stabbed her 4 children to death in their home before turning a gun on herself, in a massacre so sudden and so complete that neighbors heard nothing until it was already over. Tonya Thomas was born on February 11, 1972, in the state of Florida, and she grew up in circumstances that those who knew her and those who investigated her life in the aftermath of the events of April 27, 2012, described in terms that were consistent with a portrait of a woman who had been managing significant personal and economic challenges for most of her adult life, navigating the particular difficulties of single parenthood in an economically constrained environment with a degree of determination and practical resourcefulness that those close to her recognized and respected, even as they also recognized the toll those challenges were taking on her over time. Tonya was not a woman whose name appeared in the public record before the morning of April 27, 2012. She was not a figure of community prominence, not someone whose professional achievements or social standing had made her visible beyond the immediate circle of people who knew her personally. And the reconstruction of her life that investigators and journalists undertook in the aftermath of the tragedy in Port St. Lucie was necessarily built from the accounts of people who had known her in the ordinary context of neighborhood, family, and community, rather than from the kind of documented public record that attends the lives of people who have occupied positions of professional or social visibility. What emerged from that reconstruction was a picture of a woman whose adult life had been defined in large measure by the responsibilities and challenges of raising 4 children, largely on her own, in circumstances that required her to manage financial precariousness, the demands of employment, the logistics of childcare and schooling, and emotional labor of maintaining a household and a family, with the limited support that her social and economic circumstances afforded her. The 4 children she was raising at the time of their deaths ranged in age from 12 to 17 years old. They were no longer small children, but adolescents and preadolescents, young people old enough to have their own social worlds, their own opinions, their own needs and demands, and their own capacity for conflict with a parent whose own resources were stretched thin. Pebbles Thomas was 17 years old. Dominique Thomas was 15 years old. Jaxus Thomas was 13 years old. Joel Thomas was 12 years old. The 4 children were, by accounts from teachers, neighbors, and community members, ordinary young people in the ways that matter most. They went to school, they had friends, they had the interests and preoccupations appropriate to their ages, and they were, in the accounts of those who knew them, alive in the full and particular sense that each of them had a personality and a presence and a future that was entirely their own, and that ended on the morning of April 27, 2012, in the apartment they shared with their mother on Selvitz Road in Port St. Lucie. Port St. Lucie is a city on the Treasure Coast of Florida, in St. Lucie County, a community that grew rapidly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as part of the broader expansion of Florida's Atlantic coast, and that is characterized by the suburban residential landscape typical of Florida's growth era development. Subdivisions, apartment complexes, strip malls, and the particular social geography of a place where people have come from elsewhere to build lives that are not always as stable as the sunshine and the newness of the built environment might suggest. Tonya Thomas and her 4 children lived in an apartment in this community, and the life they were living there in the months and weeks before April 27, 2012, was one that those who knew them described as increasingly strained. Tonya had been experiencing significant difficulties, financial pressures, the stress of managing 4 adolescent children largely without meaningful support from their fathers or other family members, and a psychological state that those who had contact with her in the period before the killings described as deteriorating in ways that were visible but that had not been recognized or responded to in time to prevent what happened. The specific triggers and the precise psychological state that led Tonya Thomas to do what she did on the morning of April 27, 2012, have been the subject of investigative documentation and public discussion, but the absence of a trial, because Tonya died at the scene, means that the full evidentiary picture was never assembled and presented in the formal context of judicial proceedings, and the understanding of her psychology and her motivations is necessarily incomplete in ways that it would not be if she had survived and been prosecuted. What the investigation established, through the account of witnesses, the examination of communications in the days preceding the killings, and the physical evidence at the scene, was a picture of a woman who had been in communication with people in her life about her distress, and who had made statements that, in retrospect, could be recognized as expressions of suicidal and potentially homicidal crisis that had not been adequately identified or intercepted. There were text messages and conversations in the days before April 27th in which Tonya expressed feelings of hopelessness, desperation, and a sense that she and her children had no viable future, communications that the people who received them had not fully processed as the emergency signals they were. The pattern of these communications, the gradual escalation of desperation, the expressions of finality, the statement about the futility of continuing, is one that researchers who study familicide and murder-suicide have identified as characteristic of the period immediately preceding acts of this kind, a period during which the person moving toward violence is often reaching out in ways that are simultaneously cries for help and preparations for an act already decided upon. On the morning of April 27th, 2012, Tonya Thomas stabbed each of her 4 children multiple times with a knife inside their apartment on Selvage Road in Port St. Lucie. The stabbings were carried out in a manner and with thoroughness that the medical examiner's findings confirmed as deliberate and lethal. Each of the 4 children sustained multiple stab wounds sufficient to cause death, and the nature of the wounds indicated that the act had been carried out with a kind of focused and determined violence that speaks to a perpetrator in a state of extreme psychological disturbance rather than explosive, uncontrolled rage. Pebbles, who was 17, was stabbed multiple times. Dominique, who was 15, was stabbed multiple times. Jaxas, who was 13, was stabbed multiple times. Joel, who was 12, was stabbed multiple times. After stabbing her 4 children, Tonya Thomas shot herself with a firearm, sustaining a gunshot wound to the head from which she died at the scene. The sequence of events, the stabbings followed by the self-inflicted gunshot, was consistent with the pattern of murder-suicide that researchers who study familicide have documented across a wide range of cases, a pattern in which the perpetrator kills the family members first and then turns the lethal act on herself. The suicide being in some psychological sense the primary act, and the killing's the extension of it to the people the perpetrator cannot bear to leave behind or cannot conceive of surviving without her. The discovery of the 5 bodies in the apartment on Selvage Road was made by law enforcement responding to a call, and the scene that the first responding officers encountered was one that those who were present described as among the most devastating they had experienced in their careers. For children and their mother, all dead in the apartment they had shared, the evidence of the violence that had been done to the children, and the evidence of the self-inflicted wound that had ended Tonya's life, all present in the confined space of a residential apartment in a way that made the scale and the intimacy of the tragedy impossible to absorb in a single moment. The St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office took charge of the investigation, and the processing of the scene was conducted with a thoroughness appropriate to a case in which 5 people had died by violence, even though the absence of a surviving perpetrator meant that the investigative purpose was documentation and understanding rather than the building of a prosecutorial case. The investigation confirmed the sequence of events through physical evidence, the nature of the wounds, the positioning of the bodies, the location of the firearm, and the forensic evidence of the order in which the deaths had occurred. The medical examiner's findings established the cause and manner of death for each of the 5 individuals present in the apartment, and the St. Lucie County Medical Examiner's Office ruled the deaths of the 4 children homicides and Tonya's death a suicide, the formal legal determinations that reflected the documented reality of what had happened in that apartment. The investigation also included a review of Tonya's communications in the days preceding the killings, interviews with family members and others who had known her, and an examination of the circumstances of her life in the weeks and months before April 27, 2012, all of which contributed to the picture of a woman in acute psychological crisis whose distress had been visible to people around her but had not been met with the kind of intervention that might have changed the outcome. The response of the Port St. Lucie community and the broader public to the deaths of Pebbles, Dominique Jaxes, and Joel Thomas was one of profound grief and particular kind of shock that attends a tragedy in which the victims are children and adolescents whose lives were ordinary and full and whose futures have been entirely intact until the moment they were not. The community held vigils, and the schools attended by the Thomas children expressed their grief through the mechanisms available to educational institutions confronting the loss of students. Counseling services, memorials, the collective acknowledgement of an absence that would be felt in the ordinary daily life of classrooms and hallways and school buses for years to come. The 4 children were mourned by teachers who had known them, by friends who had sat beside them in class and played with them after school and texted them in the evenings, by the extended network of people whose lives had intersected with theirs in the ordinary ways that lives intersect when they are being lived forward rather than remembered backward. The case of Tonya Thomas was examined by researchers and commentators working in the fields of mental health, domestic violence, family violence, and child welfare in the context of the broader phenomenon of familicide and murder-suicide, a category of lethal violence that is statistically distinct from other forms of homicide in several important respects. Familicide, the killing of multiple family members, typically by a parent, is disproportionately associated with perpetrators who are themselves suicidal, and the research literature consistently identifies a combination of suicidal ideation, hopelessness, perceived entrapment, and a distorted form of attachment in which the perpetrator cannot conceive of the family members surviving without her as the psychological constellation most characteristic of this type of violence. The Tonya Thomas case fit this profile in multiple respects. The communications expressing hopelessness and finality, the apparent belief that death was the only available resolution to an unbearable situation, the extension of that belief to her children in a way that reflected a pathological rather than a genuinely loving attachment, and the sequence of violence that ended with her own death, and it was cited in discussions of the need for better identification and intervention protocols for individuals showing the warning signs associated with this type of violence. The broader systemic questions raised by the case about access to mental health services in economically distressed communities, about the adequacy of social support systems for single parents under severe stress, about the training of teachers, neighbors, and community members to recognize and respond to the warning signs of acute psychological crisis, were questions that the community and the public engaged with in the days and weeks following the tragedy with a seriousness that reflected genuine concern and genuine grief, even as the structural conditions that had contributed to those questions remained largely unchanged. The cycle in which individual tragedies generate public discussion and calls for systemic change without producing the durable institutional responses that might prevent similar tragedies is one of the most frustrating recurring patterns in the history of American public policy around mental health and child welfare, and the case of Tonya Thomas, like so many of the cases that preceded it and followed it, added its weight to that cycle without breaking it. Pebbles Thomas was 17 years old. Dominique Thomas was 15 years old. Jaxes Thomas was 13 years old. Joel Thomas was 12 years old. They were adolescents on the threshold of the independent lives that adolescents exist to prepare young people for, young people with friends and interests, and the particular energy of youth that expresses itself in ordinary pleasures and conflicts and discoveries of growing up. They were killed by their mother in their home on a morning in April 2012, in a Florida city where the sun was already bright, and the day was already ordinary for everyone who was not inside that apartment on Selvage Road, and their deaths were mourned by a community that had known them and by a country that had not, both of which were left with the unanswerable question that every tragedy of this kind leaves behind. The question of what might have been different, what intervention might have mattered, what conversation or what door opened at the right moment might have changed course of events that ended 4 young lives before they had fully begun. That question has no answer that brings the Thomas children back, and the absence of that answer is itself a kind of permanent wound in the record of what happened in Port St. Lucie on April 27, 2012. Number 10, Christy Sheats, the Texas mother who called a family meeting, retrieved a handgun, and shot her 2 daughters in front of their father before being killed by police in the street outside her home, in an act that those who knew the family struggled for years to fully comprehend. Christy Sheats was born Christy Bird on September 28, 1980, in the state of Texas, and she grew up in the kind of environment that shaped many young women of her generation in the Lone Star State, a world defined by conservative values. Strong family ties, a deep identification with the culture and social norms of Texas suburban life, and a particular set of expectations about womanhood, marriage, and family that those values and norms generate and reinforce. The details of her early life that are available in the public record are limited, as is the case with many individuals who become known to the public only through a single catastrophic event rather than through a history of public engagement or professional visibility. But what can be reconstructed from the accounts of people who knew her and from the investigative record compiled after the events of June 24th, 2016, is a picture of a woman whose adult life was organized around her identity as a wife and mother, whose sense of self was deeply invested in the domestic domain, and who carried beneath the surface of that organized domestic life a set of psychological struggles and a history of crisis that those close to her were aware of but that had not, in the years and months leading up to June 24th, 2016, been resolved or adequately managed. She was known to those around her as a woman with strong opinions, a forceful personality, and a deep attachment to certain values and beliefs, including a very strong and publicly expressed commitment to gun rights, a commitment she articulated through social media in the years before her death with consistency and passion that took on a particular and terrible significance in light of how her life ended. Jason Sheats, the man Christy married, was by accounts from those who knew the couple a steady, hard-working, and fundamentally decent man who had built a life with Christy over the course of their marriage that was, by the external markers of suburban Texas success, a genuinely successful one. A house in the Katy area west of Houston, careers, and most importantly 2 daughters who were by every account from teachers, friends, and community members bright, loving, and entirely ordinary young. Women in the best sense of that phrase. Young women whose lives were full of the specific and irreplaceable particularity that every individual human life contains, and that makes its loss an irreplaceable subtraction from a world. Taylor Sheats was 22 years old. Madison Sheats was 17 years old. Taylor was the elder daughter, a young woman who had reached adulthood and was living her life with the autonomy and forward momentum of someone in her early 20s, with relationships and plans and a future stretching ahead of her. Madison was a younger, 17 years old, still in the final stretch of adolescence, on the threshold of the transition to adulthood that the following years would have brought her. Both daughters were living at or near the family home at the time of the events of June 24th, 2016, and both were present when their mother called a family meeting that would end their lives. The marriage between Christy and Jason Sheats had been troubled for a period of time before June 2016, and the nature and extent of those troubles were subject to considerable investigative attention and public discussion in the aftermath of the killings. Christy had a documented history of mental health struggles that included prior psychiatric hospitalizations and interactions with mental health services that those close to the family were aware of, and the period leading up to June 24th, 2016, appears to have been one in which those struggles were intensifying rather than resolving. There had been discussions within the family about the state of the marriage, and Jason had apparently indicated that he was considering or had decided upon divorce, a development that those who have analyzed the case have identified as a significant contextual factor in the events that followed, not because divorce justifies or explains what Christy did, but because the prospect of the dissolution of the marriage appears to have been experienced by Christy as a crisis of the first order, one that interacted with her existing psychological vulnerabilities in ways that accelerated the deterioration of her mental state in the weeks and days before the shooting. The specific content of what was said between Christy and Jason about the marriage, about divorce, and about the family's future in the period leading up to June 24th is known in its broad outlines from Jason's accounts to investigators and from communications reviewed during the investigation. But the precise sequence of psychological events that led Christy from wherever she was at the beginning of that week to the act she committed on Friday evening is something that can only be partially reconstructed from the available evidence. On the evening of June 24, 2016, Christy Sheats called a family meeting at the family home in the Cinco Ranch subdivision of Katy, Texas, a planned community in Fort Bend County west of Houston that represents a particular version of the Texas suburban ideal: well-maintained homes, manicured lawns, good schools, the visible orderliness of a community built around the premise of stable family life. Jason was present. Taylor was present. Madison was present. The family gathered, and at some point during the gathering, Christy left the room and returned with a handgun, a .38 caliber revolver that she legally owned, a detail that connected in the most devastating way possible to her publicly expressed and passionate advocacy for gun rights, which she had articulated on social media in terms that emphasized the importance of the individual's right to be armed as a matter of fundamental freedom and personal protection. She opened fire on her daughters. Taylor was shot. Madison was shot. Jason fled the house and ran to neighbors, calling for help and calling 911. And the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office received the call and dispatched deputies to the Cinco Ranch subdivision with an urgency that reflected the nature of the emergency being reported. Christy pursued the wounded girls outside the house and into the street, and she shot them again. Both Taylor and Madison Sheats died from their gunshot wounds. Taylor at the scene, and Madison later at a hospital to which he was transported by emergency medical services. The Fort Bend County Sheriff's deputies who responded to the scene encountered Christy Sheats in the street outside the family home, armed and refusing to drop her weapon. She was shot and killed by the responding deputies. The entire sequence of events, the family meeting, the retrieval of the weapon, the initial shootings inside the house, the pursuit of the daughters into the street, the additional shootings and the confrontation with law enforcement that ended in Christy's death, unfolded with a speed and a completeness that left the community of Cinco Ranch and the broader public struggling to absorb what had happened. Neighbors who had been outside on a Friday evening in the suburban quiet of their community had witnessed portions of what occurred, and their account of sounds and the sight of what unfolded in the street outside the Sheets' home contributed to a media narrative that spread across local and then national news outlets with the rapid and disorienting pace of breaking news in the social media era. Fort Bend County Sheriff Troy Nels held a press conference that evening in which he described the events in the measured terms appropriate to a law enforcement official addressing the public in the immediate aftermath of a lethal use of force by his deputies, confirming the deaths of the two young women and the death of the suspect, and expressing condolences to the family and the community, without prejudging the ongoing investigation. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office, and its purpose, as in the cases of Lashanda Armstrong and Tonya Thomas, where the perpetrator died at or near the scene, was documentation and understanding rather than prosecution. The investigators reviewed the family's history, the communications and interactions in the days and weeks preceding the shooting, the mental health history of Christy Sheats, and the specific circumstances of the evening of June 24th, 2016, in order to compile the most complete possible account of what had happened and why. The mental health history that emerged from the investigation was significant. Christy had been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons on more than one occasion prior to June 2016, and the nature of those hospitalizations and the diagnoses and treatments associated with them became part of the investigative record that shaped the post-event understanding of the case. The prior hospitalizations were relevant not only as evidence of long-standing psychological struggles, but as context for questions about the adequacy of the mental health interventions Christy had received and whether the circumstances that led to the shooting might have been preventable with different or more sustained treatment. The question of motive, of why Christy Sheats shot her daughters, was one that investigators, journalists, and the public engaged with intensely in the days and weeks following the event, because the act was so extreme and so apparently directed at the people who were not the source of whatever conflict or crisis had triggered it that it demanded an explanation beyond the obvious. Jason Sheats, who was the person most directly involved in the marital conflict that appears to have been a significant contextual factor, survived. The daughters, who by all accounts were not the source of the conflict, and whose relationship with their mother was, by the accounts of people who knew the family a genuinely loving one, were the ones who died. The theory developed by investigators and discussed extensively in media coverage was that Christy's shooting of her daughters was in some sense directed at Jason, that was an act intended to inflict on him the most devastating possible loss, to destroy what he valued most as a response to what she experienced, as his destruction of what she valued most through the prospect of divorce. This theory, while it has a certain psychological logic and is consistent with patterns documented in the research literature on familicide and intimate partner violence, is necessarily speculative in the absence of a surviving perpetrator who could account for her own motivations. And those who knew the family have described the question of why in terms that acknowledge the inadequacy of any single explanation for an act of such extreme and irreversible violence. The social media presence that Christy had maintained in the years before the shooting became a subject to considerable public attention and discussion in the aftermath of the killings. Her posts about gun rights, including statements about the importance of keeping and bearing arms as a fundamental right that should not be infringed, were widely circulated and discussed in the context of the broader national conversation about gun violence and gun rights that the case inevitably touched. The irony of a passionate gun rights advocate using a legally owned firearm to kill her own children was not lost on commentators from across the political spectrum, and the case was referenced in debates about red flag laws, legislation that allows courts to temporarily remove firearms from individuals who are deemed to pose a danger to themselves or others. As an example of the kind of situation such laws are designed to address, the Fort Bend County case became one of several cited by advocates for red flag legislation as evidence that prior psychiatric hospitalization and documented mental health crises should trigger a more formal evaluation of an individual's continued access to firearms, a position that generated both support and opposition along the predictable lines of the gun debate, and that contributed to ongoing legislative discussions at the state and federal level about the appropriate intersection of mental health law and firearms regulation. Jason Sheats survived the events of June 24, 2016, and the years that followed were ones of public grief and private reconstruction of a kind that is almost impossible to fully imagine from the outside. The survival of a man who lost both of his daughters and his wife in the span of minutes on a Friday evening in June, who ran from his own house calling for help while his daughters were being shot, who was the target of the anger or the desperation or the pathology that produced the act without being the direct victim of it. His survival, while his daughters did not survive, is one of the most agonizing dimensions of a case that is agonizing in virtually every dimension. And the account of those who have known him in the years since the shooting describe a man living with a weight of loss and complexity that defies ordinary categories of grief. He has spoken publicly on limited occasions about the loss of his daughters and has expressed himself with a dignity and a restraint that those who have followed the case have found both remarkable and entirely comprehensible. The restraint of a man for whom the public nature of the tragedy has added an additional layer of burden to a grief that would be overwhelming in private. Taylor Sheats was 22 years old. Madison Sheats was 17 years old. They were shot by their mother in the house where they had grown up and in the street of the suburban community where their family had built its life, on a warm Friday evening in June in a neighborhood where families were outside and neighbors were present, and the ordinary sounds of suburban Texas life surrounded the extraordinary violence that was ending two young lives. Their deaths were mourned by the community of Katy and Fort Bend County, by the schools and institutions that had known them, by the friends and extended family members whose lives had intersected with theirs in all the ordinary ways, and by a broader public that encountered their story through the media coverage and the social media circulation that made the case briefly and intensely present in the national consciousness before the news cycle moved on and the case settled into the category of documented tragedies that shaped the ongoing conversations about mental health, gun violence, and a particular form of family destruction that occurs when the person charged with protecting the children is the one who ends their lives. The 10 cases documented in this series, Andrea Yates, Susan Smith, Diane Downs, Casey Anthony, Darlie Routier, Debora Green, Marilyn Lemak, Lashanda Armstrong, Tonya Thomas, and Christy Sheats, span nearly 4 decades of American criminal history and represent a range of circumstances, motivations, psychological states, and legal outcomes that collectively resist any single explanation or any simple moral framework. What they share, beyond the basic fact of mothers killing children, is the quality of their devastation. The particular and irreplaceable loss of each child who died, the permanent alteration of everyone who loved those children, and the challenge they pose to any understanding of human nature that tries to hold together the realities of maternal love and maternal violence, of mental illness and moral responsibility, of individual tragedy and systemic failure. The children in these cases, 5 Yates children, Michael and Alex Smith, Cheryl Downs, Caylee Anthony, Devin and Damon Routier, Tim and Kelly Farrar, Thomas and Nicholas, and Emily Lemak, Landon and Lance and Armstrong, Pebbles and Dominique and Jaxes and Joel Thomas, and Taylor and Madison Sheats, were 29 individual human beings whose lives were ended by the people who gave them life, and whose absence from the world is the permanent measure of what was lost.